It started with silhouettes, not speeches, not declarations, just dark shapes moving across darker water off the northern coast of Guadalcanal, where the sea had already swallowed too many ships to remember them individually. By late November of 1942, the campaign for Guadalcanal had become a contest of exhaustion. The island was starving both sides, reinforcements had to come by sea, and the sea, at night, had become the most dangerous place in the Pacific. Tassafaronga was not meant to be a decisive fleet action. It was another attempt in a long chain of attempts. The Japanese trying to deliver desperately needed supplies to their troops on Guadalcanal, the Americans trying to prevent it. But the war at sea around the Solomons had evolved into something brutally intimate. Radar screens glowed faintly. Lookouts strained their eyes into darkness. Ships maneuvered within waters so confined that mistakes multiplied faster than corrections. The American force that sailed that night believed it held the advantage. Radar offered detection before visual contact. Previous battles had shown the cost of underestimating Japanese night fighting skill. Lessons had been learned, doctrine adjusted, confidence, cautious but real, accompanied the task force into position. The Japanese, for their part, were not improvising blindly. They had refined their night torpedo tactics into a lethal art. Destroyers carried the long-range Type 93 torpedo, oxygen-fueled, fast, nearly invisible in the water. Their mission was not to seek a decisive fleet engagement. It was to slip supplies ashore and withdraw. But they were prepared to fight if necessary. Contact came in fragments, blips on radar, muzzle flashes, the sudden bloom of gunfire cutting across black water. The Americans opened fire first, shells streaking into darkness toward Japanese silhouettes. Hits were claimed, explosions erupted. For a moment, it appeared the engagement was unfolding according to plan. Then, the torpedoes arrived. They did not announce themselves with warning. They did not leave obvious trails. They ran cold and silent beneath the surface until steel met steel. American cruisers, confident in their initial success, were struck in rapid succession. The impacts were catastrophic. Ships that had been firing moments earlier were suddenly crippled, flooding, burning, or dead in the water. Chaos does not look dramatic in the dark. It sounds like orders shouted over exploding ammunition. It feels like decks tilting beneath boots. It smells like fuel and cordite mixing with salt air. Crews fought to contain fires, to restore power, to save ships already mortally wounded. Damage control teams moved through smoke-filled compartments with the knowledge that seconds mattered. The Japanese, having launched their torpedoes, withdrew with discipline. Their mission, resupply, was only partially successful. But the tactical outcome was unmistakable. The United States Navy had suffered heavy cruiser losses in an engagement it believed it controlled. The lesson was not theoretical. It was written in burning hulls drifting near Guadalcanal's shore. The Battle of Tassafaronga did not alter the ultimate outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign. Henderson Field continued to operate. Indian American ground forces remained in place. The broader arc of the Pacific War did not reverse that night, but Tassafaronga forced humility. It underscored the potency of Japanese torpedo doctrine. It revealed weaknesses in American tactical execution and communication under pressure. It reminded commanders that technology, radar, gunnery, numerical superiority did not eliminate risk. It only changed its shape. Naval warfare in the Solomons was a laboratory of brutal adaptation. Each battle refined the next. Each mistake, if survived, became instruction. Tassafaronga was one of the sharpest lessons delivered in that dark curriculum. For the sailors who lived through it, the battle was not about doctrine or analysis. It was about staying afloat, about sealing bulkheads while water rose, about manning guns even as neighboring ships burned. It was about surviving a few violent minutes that would echo through naval planning for the rest of the war. The complete history of the Battle of Tassafaronga is not a story of grand fleets clashing in daylight. It is a story of night fighting at its most unforgiving, of confidence disrupted, of silent torpedoes rewriting expectations, of how even in a campaign moving gradually toward Allied advantage, moments of sharp reversal shaped the path forward. This is the story of the Battle of Tassafaronga, a collision in darkness off Guadalcanal, where technology met experience, where assumptions met reality, and where the sea once again proved that it belonged to no one. Before you continue, take a moment to register where you are right now. Is there light around you, or has evening settled in? Is this a quiet stretch you carved out for yourself, or something you're listening to while the day moves around you? Just notice it. Tassafaronga was fought in darkness, where visibility was measured in seconds. Let this story unfold in whatever light you're in. The radar operator aboard USS Minneapolis watched his green glowing screen flicker in the darkness just after 2300 hours on November 30th, 1942. The contacts appeared at 23,000 yards, moving fast through the narrow channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. He reported the detection to the Combat Information Center, his voice steady despite knowing what radar contacts in these waters usually meant. Within minutes, every station on the heavy cruiser had gone to battle stations, and throughout Task Force 67, thousands of sailors prepared for what had become the most dangerous form of warfare in the Pacific. The waters they were entering had already claimed more than 40 warships in just 4 months of fighting, earning the grim nickname that would define this entire campaign. They called it Ironbottom Sound, and on this night, more ships would join the graveyard below. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright stood in the flag plot of Minneapolis, studying the tactical situation with mounting tension. He had assumed command of this task force just 48 hours earlier, barely enough time to learn the names of his captains, let alone train with these ships in the complex ballet of nighttime formations steaming. His force consisted of 4 heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton, along with the light cruiser Honolulu, and 6 destroyers divided between van and rear positions. On paper, it represented overwhelming firepower, dozens of 8-inch and 6-inch guns, supported by torpedo-armed destroyers equipped with the latest surface search radar. Wright knew the intelligence estimates suggested 8 Japanese destroyers making another of their infamous Tokyo Express runs down the slot, the narrow channel that funneled all naval action into a deadly corridor. What he did not know, what American naval intelligence had catastrophically failed to understand, was that those destroyers carried a weapon that would render his tactical advantages nearly meaningless. The gap between what Wright believed and what was actually true would be measured in sunken ships and lost lives before the night ended. The Tokyo Express had become a Japanese specialty by late 1942, a high-speed supply run that exploited Japan's superiority in night fighting. Fast destroyers would race down the slot at 30 knots or more, reaching Guadalcanal after dark to deliver desperately needed supplies to the starving Japanese garrison. They would unload quickly, often by simply throwing supply drums overboard to be recovered from the surf, then race back up the channel before American aircraft could catch them in daylight. The Americans had tried repeatedly to intercept these runs, with mixed and often bloody results. Earlier naval battles around Guadalcanal, Savo Island in August, Cape Esperance in October, the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, had shown that American technological advantages in radar did not automatically translate to tactical success. Japanese crews had trained extensively in night combat, developing techniques and tactics that exploited the confusion and close ranges of darkness fighting. Their optical equipment, their lookouts training, and their aggressive doctrine had repeatedly caught American forces off guard. Wright's task force represented another attempt to break this pattern, to use radar-directed gunfire to destroy the Tokyo Express before it could complete its mission. The geography of Guadalcanal forced all these naval actions into predictable patterns. The island sat in the Solomon chain like a cork in a bottle, with narrow waters to the north and south. Japanese forces approaching from their bases at Rabaul and the Upper Solomons had to funnel through the slot, making their approach predictable even if the exact timing varied. Cape Esperance marked the northwestern tip of Guadalcanal, a landmark that appeared in nearly every battle report from these waters. Savo Island, a small volcanic cone, sat like a sentinel at the entrance to the sound, and ships maneuvering around it had to account for its mass blocking both visual and radar detection. American forces based at Guadalcanal's Henderson Field could provide air cover during daylight hours, but night belonged to surface ships, where radar might detect but could not automatically defeat a well-trained enemy. The tactical problem facing Wright was deceptively simple. Locate the Japanese destroyers close to effective gun range and destroy them before they could deliver their supplies or inflict damage on his cruisers. The execution of this simple plan would prove catastrophically complex. Wright's cruisers represented the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific, each one a floating fortress of armor and guns. Minneapolis and her sister, heavy cruisers, displaced over 10,000 tons, carried 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, and boasted armor designed to withstand shell impacts from similar weapons. The 8-inch guns could hurl 260-pound armor-piercing shells over 15 miles, with reload times measured in seconds by well-trained crews. Supporting them, Honolulu mounted 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, trading punch for rate of fire. The destroyers provided anti-submarine screening, torpedo attack capability, and additional gun support with their 5-inch weapons. On the surface, this force should have overwhelmed 8 Japanese destroyers, which were smaller, more lightly armed, and lacking the heavy armor protection of cruisers. What Wright's force possessed in firepower and protection, however, it lacked in one critical area: experience working together as a coordinated team. The admiral had never commanded these specific ships in combat. The captains had never maneuvered in formation under his orders, and the complex communications required for night fighting had never been tested under the stress of actual battle. The Japanese force making its way down the slot that night operated under very different assumptions and with very different capabilities. The 8 destroyers carried supplies lashed to their decks and drums, 1,500 containers holding food, ammunition, and medical supplies desperately needed by the Guadalcanal garrison. These supplies represented the primary mission, the reason these ships were risking passage through waters dominated by American air power and increasingly contested even at night. But the destroyers also carried their primary weapons: torpedo tubes loaded with the Type 93 torpedo, a weapon American intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood. Where American planners estimated Japanese torpedoes had a maximum range of perhaps 10,000 yards, the Type 93 could reach 40,000 yards while still maintaining high speed. Where American doctrine assumed torpedo wakes would be visible, made the Type 93's oxygen propulsion left almost no trace. Where American captains planned to stand off at safe gun range beyond enemy torpedo threat, they were actually positioning themselves well within the killing zone of a weapon they did not know existed. This intelligence failure, this fundamental misunderstanding of enemy capability, would shape everything that followed. Admiral Reizo Tanaka commanded the Japanese destroyer force from his flagship Naganami, and by late 1942, he had earned a reputation as one of Japan's most skilled night-fighting commanders. The Americans had nicknamed him Tenacious Tanaka for his ability to complete Tokyo Express missions despite repeated interception attempts. His tactical doctrine differed fundamentally from American practice. Where Wright would close to gun range and slug it out with superior firepower, Tanaka planned to launch torpedoes at maximum range and then turn away before American guns could find their targets. Where American doctrine emphasized centralized control with all ships following flag instructions, Tanaka had trained his destroyer captains to act independently once battle was joined. Where American ships relied increasingly on radar for detection and targeting, Tanaka trusted his lookouts' night vision and the extensive training that made Japanese optical equipment among the world's best. These different philosophies, centralized versus distributed control, technology versus training, closing versus standoff combat, were about to collide in the darkness off Guadalcanal. The previous battles in these waters had established a grim pattern that weighed on every sailor's mind. At Savo Island in August, a Japanese cruiser force had surprised an American-Australian screening force and sunk 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. At Cape Esperance in October, an American force had achieved tactical surprise, but at the cost of friendly fire incidents and confused execution. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November had been a chaotic slugging match that saw American battleships engaging Japanese battleships at point-blank range, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Each battle had shown that radar did not guarantee victory. That night combat descended into chaos, regardless of technological advantage. And that Japanese willingness to accept close-range combat gave them opportunities to inflict disproportionate damage. The sailors on Wright's ships knew this history intimately. They knew that contacts on the radar screen might disappear into the radar shadow of Savo Island. They knew that Japanese ships could approach to suicidally close range before American guns found them. They knew that this night, like so many others in Ironbottom Sound, would test not just their equipment, but their courage, their training, and their ability to function amid the chaos of modern naval combat. At 2306 hours, the detection that would trigger the battle appeared on Minneapolis's radar screen. Range, 23,000 yards. Multiple contacts, speed high, course toward Guadalcanal. The radar operator's report set in motion a sequence of events that both sides had rehearsed countless times, but never quite the way they expected. Wright's staff began calculating intercept courses, estimating when the task force would reach effective gun range, preparing for the kind of engagement American doctrine prescribed. The destroyers in van position, led by Commander William Cole aboard Fletcher, began maneuvering to attack position, awaiting orders to launch their torpedoes. Gun crews throughout the task force received targeting information, training their weapons on coordinates provided by the Combat Information Center. In the darkness, invisible to American eyes, but clearly displayed on radar screens, the Japanese destroyers continued their approach, unaware yet that they had been detected. They carrying their cargo of supplies and their hidden cargo of devastation in the form of torpedoes more capable than their enemy imagined possible. The stage was set, the actors were in position, and the tragic play of Tassafaronga was about to begin. The torpedo that would define the Pacific War's naval combat began its development in the early 1930s at the Kure Naval Arsenal, in a workshop where Japanese engineers pursued a revolutionary concept. They were attempting to solve a problem that had vexed every navy since the torpedo's invention: how to increase range and speed while maintaining a powerful warhead and leaving minimal wake. Traditional torpedoes use compressed air for propulsion, which created visible bubble trails and limited both range and speed due to the air's chemical properties. The Japanese engineers proposed replacing compressed air with pure oxygen, a substance that burned fuel far more efficiently and left almost no visible trace in the water. The technical challenges were enormous. Pure oxygen was highly explosive, requiring special handling procedures and materials. But the potential rewards seemed worth the risk. By 1933, after hundreds of test firings and several catastrophic failures that killed technicians, the engineers achieved a successful test. They had created what would become the Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies after the war by a nickname derived from its reported 24-inch diameter, the Long Lance. The specifications of the Type 93 represented a quantum leap beyond any torpedo then in service with Western navies. The weapon measured 24 inches in diameter and stretched nearly 30 feet in length, substantially larger than the American Mark 15 torpedo's 21 inches and similar length. The warhead contained 1,080 pounds of Type 97 explosive, roughly equivalent to 1,350 pounds of TNT, compared to the Mark 15's 825-pound warhead. Range figures revealed the most dramatic difference. The Type 93 could reach 40,000 yards while still maintaining 36 knots of speed, or could achieve 49 knots at reduced range of 22,000 yards. By contrast, the American Mark 15 managed only 6,000 yards at 45 knots, or 15,000 yards at 26.5 knots. These differences were not marginal improvements, but represented a fundamental shift in what torpedoes could accomplish. A Japanese destroyer could launch torpedoes from beyond the effective range of American cruiser guns, turn away before those guns found their target, and still strike with devastating force. The oxygen propulsion left minimal wake, making the torpedo's approach nearly invisible until the moment of impact. American naval intelligence knew that Japan possessed modern torpedoes, but they fundamentally misjudged the weapon's capabilities in ways that would prove catastrophic. Pre-war assessments had estimated that Japanese torpedoes might match or slightly exceed American performance, perhaps reaching 10,000 yards maximum range. This estimate derived partly from technical assumptions. Western experts believed oxygen torpedoes were impractical due to safety concerns, and partly from cultural bias that consistently underestimated Japanese technological sophistication. Intelligence analysts in Washington and Pearl Harbor received multiple reports from the China theater in the late 1930s describing unexplained long-range torpedo attacks, but these reports were systematically dismissed. The analysts assumed observer error, exaggerated enemy claims, or misidentification of the actual weapon type. When Chinese naval officers reported that their cruiser, Ping Hai, had been struck by a torpedo launched from 18,000 yards away during fighting near Shanghai in 1937, the American naval attaché filed the report with a notation suggesting confusion about actual attack range. Similar reports from British observers in Southeast Asia in 1941 received the same treatment. Technically implausible, therefore probably inaccurate, filed and forgotten. The Japanese Navy protected the Type 93's capabilities with elaborate security measures, understanding that this weapon represented a critical tactical advantage. Torpedo exercises were conducted in restricted waters away from foreign observers. Technical manuals were classified at the highest levels and distributed only to personnel with direct operational need. Captured documents were destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. And Japanese sailors were instructed to avoid discussing torpedo performance even in internal communications that might be intercepted. This operational security proved remarkably effective through the first year of the Pacific War. Despite American code-breaking successes that revealed Japanese battle plans and ship movements, the specific capabilities of the Type 93 remained largely unknown to American intelligence. Even after early battles where Japanese torpedoes achieved hits at ranges that should have been impossible, according to American estimates, intelligence analysts found explanations that preserved their existing assumptions rather than forcing a fundamental reassessment. The torpedoes must have been launched closer than reported, or perhaps submarine-launched rather than surface-launched, or perhaps the damage came from different weapons entirely. Captain Torajiro Sato commanded the destroyer Naganami as it loaded supplies and torpedoes on November 30th, 1942, preparing for the Tokyo Express run to Guadalcanal. Each destroyer in the formation carried 8 to 16 reloadable torpedo tubes, and well-trained crews could accomplish a reload in approximately 15 minutes, even under combat conditions. The standard tactical doctrine called for launching a full spread at maximum effective range, typically 20,000 yards or more, then turning away to reload while maintaining speed above 30 knots. If the enemy closed to gun range, the destroyers would launch their second spread and continue evasive maneuvers using superior speed and agility to avoid prolonged gun battles with heavier ships. This doctrine reflected both the Type 93's capabilities and the Japanese destroyer force's realistic assessment of their vulnerability to sustained gunfire. A destroyer's thin armor provided little protection against 8-inch shells, so avoiding close engagement while still delivering torpedo attacks represented sound tactical thinking. The American assumption that Japanese destroyers would close to traditional torpedo range of 5,000 yards or less meant that American cruiser captains would position themselves exactly where Japanese doctrine intended, well within torpedo range, but still beyond the range where their superior guns could be immediately decisive. The technical specifications that made the Type 93 so formidable created operational challenges that Japanese crews had to master through extensive training, Pure oxygen was extraordinarily dangerous to handle, requiring special procedures for loading, storing, and maintaining the torpedoes. An oxygen leak near any fuel source or spark could trigger catastrophic explosions, and several Japanese destroyers had suffered accidental detonations during training exercises in the 1930s. Crews learned to treat the weapons with extreme caution, following elaborate safety protocols that Western navies might have considered too cumbersome for operational use. The torpedoes also required careful depth setting and precise calculation of lead angles due to their long run times to distant targets. A torpedo launched at 20,000 yards would take several minutes to reach its target, requiring accurate prediction of enemy course and speed. Japanese fire control teams trained constantly in these calculations, developing both mathematical skills and intuitive judgment about enemy maneuvers. The combination of technical excellence in the weapon itself and thorough training in its employment created a capability that exceeded the sum of its parts. Admiral Raizo Tanaka understood that the Type 93 gave his destroyer force a realistic chance of success, even when facing superior American gun power. His tactical planning for the Tassafaronga mission reflected this understanding. If his destroyers detected American forces, they would jettison the supply drums to restore full speed and maneuverability, all launch torpedoes at maximum effective range, and turn away before American guns could achieve decisive hits. The supply mission was important, but in Tanaka's calculation, preserving his ships and inflicting damage on American forces took precedence over delivering every supply drum to Guadalcanal's beaches. This prioritization reflected Japan's deteriorating strategic position in the Solomons by late 1942. Supplies meant nothing if the American Navy controlled the surrounding waters, but damaged or sunk American cruisers would shift the naval balance and potentially allow future supply runs to proceed with less opposition. Tanaka's willingness to sacrifice the immediate supply mission for tactical advantage demonstrated the kind of flexible thinking that had made him one of Japan's most effective destroyer commanders. The contrast between Japanese and American torpedo capabilities extended beyond simple performance specifications to fundamental design philosophy. American torpedoes of 1942 suffered from multiple technical problems that the Bureau of Ordnance had spent years denying despite mounting evidence from combat operations. The Mark 15 ran deeper than its depth setting, causing torpedoes to pass harmlessly under enemy hulls. The magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, frequently malfunctioned or fired prematurely. The contact exploder sometimes failed to detonate even on direct hits, with pins that bent rather than triggering the firing mechanism. Submarine commanders had been reporting these problems since the war's opening months, but the Bureau of Ordnance insisted the weapons were functioning as designed and blamed operator error. Surface ships firing Mark 15s experienced similar failures, but the chaos of surface combat made it difficult to track individual torpedo performance. This meant that, even when American destroyers successfully launched torpedoes at the Battle of Tassafaronga, the probability of achieving hits would be dramatically lower than Japanese probability with Type 93s, compounding the existing range and performance disparities. The Japanese advantage in torpedo technology represented one element in a broader pattern of American intelligence failures regarding enemy capabilities. Similar underestimation affected assessments of Japanese aircraft performance, where the Zero fighter's range and maneuverability shocked American pilots in early encounters. Naval planners had assumed that Japanese optical equipment was inferior to American radar, only to discover that well-trained lookouts using excellent optics could match or exceed radar detection under many conditions. The assumption that Japanese industry could not produce sophisticated technology in quantity had been disproven by the rapid expansion of their naval air forces and the quality of their ship construction. These intelligence failures shared a common origin in cultural bias and a tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirmed existing beliefs rather than challenging them. The institutional culture of American intelligence agencies in the early 1940s rewarded analysts who supported prevailing views and treated skeptically those who suggested that enemy capabilities might exceed estimates. This culture created systematic blind spots that would cost lives throughout the war's early years. At 2100 hours on November the 30th, Sato's destroyers loaded their final Type 93 torpedoes and cast off from their staging base, beginning the run down the slot toward Guadalcanal. Each destroyer carried its full complement of torpedoes, reloads secured below decks, with crews drilled to combat readiness. The supply drums lashed to the decks would be jettisoned immediately if American forces appeared, a calculated sacrifice that reflected Tanaka's priorities. The Japanese force steamed in two columns, maintaining radio silence, relying on visual signals and prearranged maneuvers to coordinate their movement. No radar guided their approach. No electronic sensors scanned the darkness ahead. Instead, lookouts trained for years in night vision watched for any sign of enemy ships, while officers calculated intercept angles and torpedo spreads in their heads or on paper charts. They were sailing toward an engagement where their primary weapon represented a decisive technological advantage their enemy did not know existed, carrying the possibility of strategic impact far beyond the tactical mission of delivering supplies. The Battle of Tassafaronga would prove whether doctrine, training, and superior weapons could overcome numerical disadvantage and the enemy's technological edge in radar detection. The Combat Information Center aboard USS Minneapolis hummed with controlled tension at 2240 hours as radar operators tracked the approaching Japanese formation. Admiral Wright stood near the plotting table where staff officers translated radar contacts into tactical diagrams, showing enemy position, course, and speed overlaid on the chart of waters off Guadalcanal. The radar picture showed 8 contacts in formation, range decreasing steadily as both forces closed on converging courses. Wright's staff calculated that at current speeds, the task force would reach effective gun range, estimated at 8,000 to 10,000 yards, in approximately 40 minutes. This was the moment American doctrine prescribed: detect the enemy with radar, close to gun range while maintaining formation integrity, and destroy with superior firepower delivered by cruiser main batteries. The plan seemed sound, built on the technological advantage of radar, allowing American ships to detect and track enemies that could not detect them in return. What the doctrine failed to account for was an enemy whose primary weapon could strike at twice the range American planners considered safe, and whose tactical doctrine deliberately avoided the close-range gun battle American cruisers were optimized to win. Aboard the destroyer Naganami, Admiral Tanaka studied the darkness ahead with growing certainty that American ships were near. His force lacked radar, so detection depended entirely on visual sighting by trained lookouts using high-quality optical equipment. The Japanese Navy had invested heavily in night vision training, with lookouts spending hours in darkened rooms to develop their eyes' sensitivity before watch duty, and using specialized binoculars that gathered available light more effectively than standard equipment. By 2300 hours, Tanaka's lookouts had not yet spotted the American force, but the Admiral's tactical sense, honed by dozens of Tokyo Express runs and multiple night engagements, suggested contact was imminent. His standing orders to all captains were clear. If American forces were detected, jettison supply drums immediately, launch torpedoes at maximum effective range, turn away to reload, and prepare for subsequent attacks if tactical situation permitted. These orders reflected a fundamental difference from American doctrine, where Wright planned to close and overwhelm with firepower. Tanaka planned to strike from standoff range and evade before the enemy could respond effectively. Two tactical philosophies, developed independently and refined through different training experiences, were converging toward a test that would validate one and devastate the other. American cruiser doctrine in 1942 emphasized the battle line formation, a concept inherited from battleship tactics and adapted for cruiser operations. The 4 heavy cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton, steamed in column formation, each ship following the one ahead at precise intervals. The light cruiser Honolulu held position in the line, contributing her 15 6-inch guns to the formation's firepower. And this arrangement maximized the number of guns that could bear on a single target, while minimizing the risk of collision during high-speed maneuvering in darkness. Destroyer divisions operated ahead of and behind the cruiser column, providing anti-submarine screening, torpedo attack capability, and additional reconnaissance. The formation's geometry reflected assumptions about how night combat would develop. Radar would detect the enemy at long range. The formation would maneuver to bring maximum guns to bear, and concentrated firepower would destroy targets before they could close to effective torpedo range. These assumptions had worked reasonably well in previous engagements where American forces achieved tactical surprise, or where Japanese forces accepted close-range combat. At Tassafaronga, the assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese destroyer doctrine evolved through extensive study of night combat tactics and realistic training that emphasized speed, surprise, and torpedo attack. The 8 destroyers under Tanika's command typically operated in 2 loose columns rather than rigid formation, allowing individual captains flexibility to maneuver independently once combat commenced. Each destroyer captain understood the standard tactical sequence: detect enemy, jettison cargo to restore maximum speed, calculate torpedo firing solution, launch full spread, turn away at maximum speed while reloading tubes, reassess tactical situation, and either launch second spread or retire depending on circumstances. This doctrine accepted the reality that destroyers could not survive prolonged gun battles with heavy cruisers, so it emphasized hitting first with torpedoes and then avoiding return fire through speed and maneuver. The Type 93's range made this doctrine viable. Destroyers could launch at 20,000 yards, turn away, and still have torpedoes in the water, moving toward targets while American guns were still out of effective range. Training exercises had refined these tactics over years of peacetime preparation and months of wartime experience, creating a level of tactical sophistication that American intelligence had not fully appreciated. Wright's battle plan, developed in consultation with his staff during the approach to the expected intercept point, called for the van destroyers to attack first with torpedoes once the enemy was located. These destroyers, Fletcher, Perkins, Maury, and Drayton, would close ahead of the cruiser column and launch their Mark 15 torpedoes at targets designated by the flagship. Following the destroyer attack, the cruiser column would open gunfire, ideally catching the Japanese force disordered by torpedo hits and unable to coordinate effective response. The rear destroyers, Lamson and Lardner, would prevent any Japanese ships from escaping by closing the exit route. This plan followed standard doctrine and seemed reasonable given the intelligence estimate that Japanese destroyers would attempt to close for gun and torpedo, combat at traditional ranges of 5,000 yards or less. Yet the fatal flaw in the plan was the assumption about Japanese torpedo range, an assumption that placed American cruisers well within the killing zone of weapons they did not know existed. Wright's confidence in his firepower advantage was justified on paper, but failed to account for the possibility that the battle might never reach the range where that advantage could be decisive. The tactical situation at 2306 hours, when Minneapolis first detected the Japanese formation, embodied the collision of these different doctrines. Range was 23,000 yards, with both forces on converging courses that would bring them closer at roughly 1,000 yards per minute. Wright's immediate concern was maneuvering his formation to bring maximum guns to bear, while allowing the van destroyers to launch their torpedo attack. Tanaka's immediate concern, once his lookouts reported the American force, was calculating the optimal torpedo launch range and preparing his destroyers to jettison their supply drums. The American formation maintained its rigid column, each ship following precisely in the wake of the ship ahead, maximizing gun concentration, but also making the formation predictable and relatively slow to maneuver. The Japanese formation began splitting into two groups, reducing target concentration and complicating American fire control while positioning destroyers for optimal torpedo spreads. These different tactical responses reflected not just different doctrines, but different assessments of what weapons would prove decisive in the coming engagement. American confidence in radar as a decisive advantage was about to be tested against Japanese confidence in their torpedo capabilities. The radar operators aboard Minneapolis tracked every Japanese ship with precision, updating range, bearing, and speed continuously. This information fed into fire control computers that could calculate gun solutions far more quickly than manual methods allowed. In theory, radar-directed gunfire could achieve hits on targets that visual fire control could never engage effectively in darkness. The reality was more complex. Radar could detect and track ships, but achieving hits still required visual confirmation of splashes to correct aim. And at night, those splashes were difficult to observe. Fire control radar existed, but was not yet widely deployed or fully reliable. The result was that radar provided significant advantage in detection and initial targeting, but actually achieving hits on maneuvering targets in darkness remained challenging. Japanese doctrine acknowledged this reality and sought to exploit it by avoiding prolonged gun battles in favor of torpedo attacks launched before the enemy could bring guns to bear effectively. The question was whether American gunnery could damage or sink Japanese destroyers before those destroyers launched their torpedoes and turned away. The supply drums lashed to Japanese destroyer decks represented both the mission's primary purpose and a significant tactical liability. And each destroyer carried approximately 150 to 200 drums containing food, ammunition, and medical supplies. These drums reduced speed by several knots and degraded maneuverability, making the destroyers less effective as combat platforms. Tanaka's orders specified that if American forces appeared, the supply mission would be immediately subordinated to the tactical mission of engaging and damaging enemy ships. The drums would be cut loose and jettisoned, restoring full combat capability, even though this meant failing the supply delivery mission. This prioritization reflected Tanaka's assessment that damaging American cruisers served Japanese strategic interests more than delivering a few days' worth of supplies to Guadalcanal. The garrison was already on starvation rations and would remain so regardless of this particular delivery. Sinking or crippling American cruisers, however, would shift the naval balance and potentially allow future supply runs to proceed with less opposition. The decision to prioritize combat over supply delivery demonstrated a level of strategic thinking often absent in rigid adherence to assigned missions. The officers aboard Wright's flagship understood that they held numerical and firepower advantages, but also understood that night combat tended toward chaos regardless of technological edge. Previous battles in these waters had demonstrated that radar did not guarantee victory, that visual confusion could overwhelm technological advantage, and that Japanese willingness to accept close combat created opportunities for devastating attacks. Wright's inexperience with this particular task force compounded these concerns. He had never maneuvered these ships in formation under combat conditions, never tested their communications procedures under stress, never developed the intuitive understanding of his captain's capabilities that came from extended operations together. The staff officers around him were similarly new to working together as a team. In contrast, Tanaka had been conducting Tokyo Express runs with many of these same destroyer captains for months, developing shared understanding and mutual confidence through repeated operations. This difference in operational familiarity would matter when split-second decisions determined tactical outcomes and when communications failures could prove fatal. At 2306 hours, as radar confirmed contact with the Japanese force, both admirals faced the moment where doctrine would be tested by reality. Wright ordered his force to battle stations and began maneuvering to bring his cruisers into optimal firing position, confident that superior firepower and radar advantage would overwhelm the Japanese destroyer force. Tanaka, detecting American ships through his lookouts reports, ordered the supply drums jettisoned and prepared his destroyers to launch torpedoes at ranges American doctrine considered safe from torpedo threat. The stage was set for a battle that would demonstrate which naval philosophy, centralized gun battle or distributed torpedo attack, better suited the realities of nighttime naval combat in 1942. Within the next 30 minutes, one doctrine would be validated and the other would be revealed as fatally flawed, and the cost would be measured in damaged and sunken ships and hundreds of lives lost to the dark waters off Guadalcanal. Commander William Cole stood in the pilot house of USS Fletcher, lead destroyer in the Van Division, watching the radar contacts close while waiting for permission to attack. The established doctrine required destroyer commanders to request authorization from the task force flagship before launching torpedoes. It'd be a procedure designed to prevent friendly fire incidents and maintain centralized tactical control. At 2306 hours, with Japanese contacts at 23,000 yards and closing, Cole requested permission to commence torpedo attack. The radio circuits carried his request to Minneapolis, where Admiral Wright and his staff evaluated the tactical situation and considered the request. Minutes passed, crucial minutes during which the range decreased by roughly 1,000 yards every 60 seconds, while the flagship deliberated. At 2310 hours, Cole repeated his request, emphasizing the decreasing range and optimal firing window. Still, no authorization came. The doctrine that prioritized centralized control was creating delay that would prove catastrophic. In unburning time, while Japanese destroyers closed to their own optimal torpedo launch range. The 10 minutes between Cole's first request and Wright's eventual authorization at 2316 hours represented one of the most consequential delays in American naval history. During those 600 seconds, the range closed from 23,000 yards to approximately 7,000 yards, transforming the tactical geometry completely. At 23,000 yards, American destroyers launching first would have caught the Japanese force before it reached optimal torpedo firing position, potentially disrupting or preventing the enemy torpedo attack. At 7,000 yards, the Japanese destroyers had already reached their preferred launch range and were preparing to fire. The delay derived from Wright's adherence to doctrine that required flagship authorization, combined with his unfamiliarity with his destroyer commanders and uncertainty about whether the range was truly optimal for Mark 15 torpedo attacks. This adherence to peacetime doctrine in wartime circumstances illustrated how institutional procedures designed for one set of conditions could prove disastrous when conditions changed. The delay was not the result of incompetence or cowardice, but of following the procedures that Wright had been trained to follow, procedures that failed to account for the speed and fluidity of night surface combat. At 2316 hours, Wright finally authorized the destroyer torpedo attack, and Cole immediately ordered his 4 destroyers to commence firing. Fletcher, Perkins, Drayton, and Maury launched 20 Mark 15 torpedoes toward the Japanese formation, now at approximately 7,000 yards range. The destroyers followed their training precisely, calculating firing solutions, setting torpedo depths and speeds, and launching in coordinated spreads designed to bracket the target area. The Mark 15s entered the water and began their runs toward the Japanese destroyers, motors driving them at 45 knots through the dark sea. What happened next illustrated the multiple problems plaguing American torpedoes in 1942. Some ran deeper than their depth setting and passed harmlessly beneath their targets. Some suffered mechanical failures that sent them off course or stopped their motors entirely. And some reached their targets but failed to explode due to defective firing mechanisms. If the exact number of torpedoes that functioned as designed remains uncertain, but the result was clear. Not a single American torpedo achieved a hit on any Japanese ship. 20 weapons launched at optimal range against targets that radar had precisely located, and 0 hits achieved. The torpedo attack that doctrine prescribed as the opening blow had failed completely. While American destroyers were launching their ineffective torpedoes, Japanese destroyer crews were executing their well-practiced attack sequence with devastating precision. At 2320 hours, just 4 minutes after receiving permission to fire, the American destroyer attack was already spent, and Japanese destroyers were launching their response. Tanaka's 8 destroyers, now organized in 2 groups after jettisoning their supply drums, began launching Type 93 torpedoes from ranges between 8,000 and 12,000 yards. The launch sequence continued for approximately 4 minutes as different destroyers achieved firing positions and released their weapons. In total, 44 Type 93 torpedoes entered the water, spreading across a wide frontal arc calculated to intercept the American cruiser formation's predicted positions. The Japanese destroyers did not wait to observe results, but immediately executed emergency turns that reversed their course while maintaining high speed. This maneuver, practiced countless times in training, presented minimal target profile to American guns, while the destroyers' stern-mounted torpedo tubes completed their launches. Within 5 minutes of launching their torpedoes, the Japanese destroyers were racing away at 30-plus knots, having delivered their attack before American cruiser guns could achieve effective fire. The American cruiser line opened gunfire at 2321 hours, just as the Japanese destroyers were completing their turnaway maneuver. Minneapolis alone fired 221 rounds of 8-inch ammunition in the opening minutes of the engagement, a massive expenditure of firepower that demonstrated both the cruiser's rate of fire and the difficulty of achieving hits on fast-moving, maneuvering targets in darkness. The other cruisers added their own salvos: New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton with 8-inch guns, Honolulu with 6-inch weapons, creating a spectacular display of tracers and explosions that lit the night but achieved limited results. It is the Japanese destroyers' turnaway had taken them rapidly out of effective gun range, and the visual confusion of night combat made precise fire control extremely difficult. Radar could track targets, but actually hitting them required visual observation of shell splashes to correct aim, and in darkness those splashes were difficult to see. The result was impressive-looking gunfire that consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, but inflicted minimal damage on an enemy that was already disengaging, while their torpedoes continued their journey toward American ships. One Japanese destroyer, however, did not successfully complete the turnaway maneuver, and became the focus of overwhelming American firepower. Takanami, the rearmost destroyer in the Japanese formation, either suffered mechanical problems or made a navigation error that left her illuminated in American searchlight beams and under fire from multiple cruisers simultaneously. Commander Takatsugu Jojima, commanding Takanami, found his ship caught in a desperate situation, but made a decision that would save his formation. Rather than attempting to flee and drawing fire toward other Japanese destroyers, he maintained his course and accepted the punishment his ship would receive. For approximately 7 minutes, from 2320 until 2327, Takanami absorbed fire from at least 5 American ships. Shells struck her superstructure, penetrated her hull, started fires, and killed dozens of her crew. By 2327, Takanami was dead in the water and burning fiercely, her crew fighting fires and flooding while abandoning the guns that had become untenable. Her sacrifice, however, had achieved its purpose. American fire had concentrated on the single visible target, while the other 7 Japanese destroyers escaped and their torpedoes continued toward impact. The concentration of American firepower on Takanami illustrated a fundamental problem with night combat in 1942. Once a ship became visible, illuminated by searchlights, fires, or gun flashes, it drew fire from every ship that could see it, often resulting in massive overkill on one target, while other targets escaped attention. The estimated 200 shells that hit Takanami represented firepower sufficient to destroy several destroyers, wasted on a single target that was already crippled after the first dozen hits. This concentration occurred partly because human nature drew gunners toward the visible target, and partly because American fire control doctrine emphasized concentrated fire on designated targets rather than distributing fire across multiple enemies. In daylight with good visibility, concentrated fire made sense as a way to ensure targets were destroyed rather than merely damaged. In night combat with limited visibility and multiple threats, the doctrine resulted in devastating one visible target while allowing invisible threats to strike unmolested. The Japanese tactical doctrine of accepting one ship's sacrifice to allow others to escape exploited this American tendency perfectly. While American guns destroyed Takanami, American lookouts began reporting sightings that would determine the battle's outcome. On torpedoes in the water, calls came from multiple ships, but the reports were fragmentary and uncertain. How many torpedoes? From what direction? At what range? The radar operators who had so precisely tracked Japanese destroyers before the engagement could not detect torpedoes, which were too small and too low in the water to show on surface search radar. Visual detection of torpedoes at night was extremely difficult. The Type 93's wakeless design made it nearly invisible, and even conventional torpedoes with visible wakes were hard to spot in the darkness and wave action. The torpedo warning system that might have allowed American ships to maneuver defensively did not exist in any effective form. By the time lookouts spotted torpedoes close enough to identify them with confidence, those torpedoes were already in their terminal runs with only seconds before impact. The American formation, steaming in its rigid column and focused on gun action against visible targets, was unable to take effective evasive action against threats that remained invisible until the moment of impact. The tactical situation at 2325 hours showed the complete reversal of the battle's expected course. American doctrine had predicted that radar detection would enable destroyer torpedo attacks to disrupt the Japanese formation, followed by cruiser gunfire destroying disorganized targets. Instead, the destroyer torpedo attack had failed completely due to weapon defects. The Japanese formation had launched a massive torpedo salvo, while remaining largely undamaged, and American cruisers were blazing away at a single dying destroyer while 44 torpedoes approached their formation unseen. Wright and his staff aboard Minneapolis did not yet understand how completely their tactical plan had failed, but they were about to receive devastating education. The Type 93 torpedoes, launched between 4 and 7 minutes earlier from ranges between 8,000 and 12,000 yards, were now approaching their targets. The weapons were running true, their oxygen propulsion leaving almost no wake, their sophisticated guidance systems keeping them on calculated intercept courses. In less than 5 minutes, those torpedoes would begin striking American cruisers with catastrophic results. The difference between doctrine and reality, and between what American planners expected and what was actually happening, could not have been more stark. The expected outcome, American destroyers disrupting Japanese formation with torpedoes, cruisers destroying disorganized enemies with gunfire, had inverted into its opposite. Japanese destroyers launching effective torpedo attack while evading American gunfire, American cruisers concentrated on a single dying target while invisible threats approached. The next few minutes would demonstrate conclusively which Navy had better understood the realities of night surface combat in 1942, which doctrine better matched actual capabilities to tactical employment, and which technological advantage, radar or Type 93 torpedoes, proved more decisive in the specific circumstances of this engagement. The answer would be written in damage and casualties aboard American cruisers that had positioned themselves precisely where Japanese doctrine intended them to be, well within torpedo range, but unable to bring their gun superiority to bear before Japanese torpedoes struck. The destroyer Takanami burned in the darkness at 2327 hours, her superstructure shattered by over 200 shell hits from American cruisers and destroyers. Commander Takatsugu Jojima, wounded but still directing damage control efforts from the wrecked bridge, understood that his ship was dying, but that her death was buying time for the rest of the Japanese formation. The American searchlights that had found Takanami remained locked on her position, and the cruisers that had poured such devastating fire continued to target the burning destroyer, even after she had lost all offensive capability. This concentration of enemy attention was exactly what Tanaka's doctrine prescribed when a ship became isolated and visible. Accept the sacrifice, draw fire, allow the formation to escape, and the torpedoes to complete their runs without American interference. Jojima had made this choice consciously, maintaining course rather than attempting evasion that might draw fire toward other Japanese destroyers. His crew paid the price in casualties and damage, but the tactical mission continued. The American fire that destroyed Takanami represented both the effectiveness of American gunnery when targets were visible and the limitations of that gunnery in the context of night combat. The 8-inch shells from Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and Northampton struck with tremendous force, each impact carrying enough explosive energy to penetrate destroyer-grade armor and detonate inside the hull or superstructure. The 6-inch shells from Honolulu and the 5-inch shells from American destroyers added to the deluge of fire. Under such bombardment, any destroyer would have been crippled quickly, but the concentration continued well past the point of tactical necessity. By 2325, Takanami was clearly out of action, dead in the water, burning, with her weapons silent. Yet American ships continued firing for several more minutes, ensuring total destruction, but also wasting ammunition and fire control attention on a target that posed no further threat. This pattern would repeat throughout the Pacific War, American forces achieving overwhelming firepower concentration on visible targets while potentially missing less visible but more dangerous threats. The 7 Japanese destroyers that escaped while Takanami drew American fire had executed their tactical mission with precision. After launching their torpedoes, they maintained high speed away from the American formation, putting distance between themselves and enemy guns while their weapons continued toward their targets. The turnaway maneuver, practiced countless times in training, had worked exactly as Doctrine prescribed. Expose torpedo tubes, launch full spreads, reverse course while maintaining maximum speed, open range before enemy guns could achieve effective fire. By 2330, as these 7 destroyers were racing northwest at 30-plus knots, already outside effective gun range and accelerating away. Some were beginning reload procedures for their torpedo tubes, preparing for a potential second attack if tactical circumstances permitted. Others were assessing damage from the few American shells that had found targets during the brief gun engagement. All were monitoring the situation, waiting to see if their torpedoes would achieve the hits that Type 93's capabilities promised. American radar operators aboard Minneapolis and other cruisers struggled to maintain tracking on the Japanese destroyers as they turned away and increased speed. The radar picture that had been so clear during the approach phase became confused as targets maneuvered, split into multiple groups. They then moved toward the limit of effective radar range. Some contacts disappeared entirely, either masked by Savo Island's bulk or simply lost in the clutter of returns from waves and rain squalls. Other contacts appeared that might be new ships, or might be ghost images created by atmospheric conditions affecting radar propagation. The fire control teams that had been calculating gun solutions found their targets disappearing from radar screens or moving too rapidly to track effectively. This deterioration of the radar picture coincided with the American formation's focus on Takanami, creating a situation where American attention was concentrated on a dying ship while the larger tactical picture became increasingly unclear. The Japanese formation's status, location, and intentions were no longer clear. But American doctrine provided no good answer for how to respond to this tactical uncertainty. The 44 Type 93 torpedoes launched by Japanese destroyers between 2320 and 2324 were approaching their targets by 2327. The weapons ran at depths between 10 and 15 feet, moving at speeds between 45 and 50 knots, depending on their specific settings. Their oxygen propulsion created almost no visible wake, making visual detection nearly impossible until the last moments before impact. The torpedoes' targeting was not guided. Once launched, they ran straight courses based on their initial settings. But the Japanese fire control teams had calculated their spreads expertly, distributing torpedoes across the width of the American formation's projected position. The American cruisers, steaming in their rigid column formation, presented an ideal target: predictable courses, constant speeds, ships following in each other's wakes. This formation geometry, designed to maximize gun concentration, made torpedo targeting relatively simple, since calculating one ship's position effectively calculated the entire column's position. The Japanese spreads, launched over several minutes, covered variations in the American formation's possible maneuvers, creating overlapping threat zones that would prove impossible to avoid. American lookouts reported torpedo sightings with increasing urgency as the weapons approached. Torpedoes to port, torpedoes to starboard, torpedoes ahead. The calls came from multiple ships. But the fragmentary nature of the reports made coordinated evasive action nearly impossible. Torpedo wakes, when visible at all in the darkness, appeared briefly before disappearing in wave troughs, or being lost in the visual confusion of gunfire and explosions from the engagement with Takanami. The cruiser's commanders faced impossible decisions with inadequate information: which reports were accurate, which direction to turn, how many torpedoes were actually in the water, from what bearings were they approaching. The rigid formation that had served well during the approach phase now became a liability, as maneuvering one ship could create collision risks with ships ahead or astern. Some captains ordered emergency turns. Others maintained course, believing their lookouts had misidentified torpedo wakes. Still others attempted to increase or decrease speed to throw off torpedo targeting. The lack of coordinated evasive doctrine meant each ship acted independently, sometimes canceling the effects of other ships' maneuvers. The first torpedo struck Minneapolis at 2327 hours, impacting forward near the bow and detonating with catastrophic effect. The 1,080-pound warhead exploded below the waterline, creating a pressure wave that exceeded the hull's structural design limits. The bow section forward of Turret 1 was blown completely off, separating from the main hull and sinking rapidly while the rest of the ship maintained forward momentum. Flooding rushed into the spaces exposed by the bow's loss, and damage control parties scrambled to seal bulkheads and prevent progressive flooding that could sink the entire ship. Admiral Wright, thrown against bulkheads by the impact shock, maintained consciousness but faced the immediate reality that his flagship was severely damaged and might be sinking. Seconds later, a second torpedo struck Minneapolis further aft, compounding the damage and killing 37 sailors instantly. The flagship that had commanded this engagement was now crippled, unable to maintain fleet speed, her forward firepower eliminated, her survival uncertain. The concentration of American firepower on Takanami had created a fatal distraction at the precise moment when lookouts should have been scanning for torpedo threats, and when commanders should have been focused on defensive maneuvering. The psychological effect of having a visible, burning target drew attention away from the invisible threats approaching from other bearings. Historians analyzing the battle would later conclude that if American ships had remained focused on defensive operations rather than continuing to pound an already crippled destroyer, some of the torpedo hits might have been avoided through earlier detection and more effective evasive maneuvers. This conclusion highlights a fundamental tension in naval combat between offensive and defensive operations. The aggressive pursuit of enemy destruction can create vulnerabilities that more cautious defensive tactics might avoid. American Doctrine, in 1942, emphasized aggressive offense, the destruction of enemy forces as the primary objective. And this emphasis served well in many circumstances, but at Tassafaronga it meant continuing to attack Takanami while torpedoes approached undetected. The tactical geometry at 2327 hours showed the complete reversal of the battle's expected course. American cruisers, which should have been destroying disorganized Japanese destroyers with overwhelming gunfire, were instead receiving devastating torpedo hits, while the Japanese formation escaped largely intact. The technological advantage of radar had enabled detection, but had not prevented the Japanese from launching their attack at optimal range. The firepower advantage of American cruisers had been brought to bear against a single dying destroyer, while the main Japanese force remained beyond effective gun range. The doctrine that had seemed so sound, close to gun range, destroy with superior firepower, had proven catastrophically flawed when facing an enemy whose primary weapon could strike at twice the range American planners considered safe. The next few minutes would see additional torpedo hits that would transform tactical defeat into catastrophe, as the Type 93 torpedoes continued to strike American cruisers that had positioned themselves exactly where Japanese doctrine predicted they would be. Takanami continued to burn through this period, her crew fighting for survival, even as their ship drew its last. Historians later confirmed that Takanami sank sometime around 0300 hours on December 1st, taking most of her crew with her. Commander Jojima was among the casualties, dying either from his wounds or from drowning when the ship went down. Of Takanami's complement of approximately 200 officers and men, only a few dozen survived to be rescued by other Japanese destroyers that returned to search the battle area after the engagement concluded. These survivors reported that their captain had maintained his post to the end, directing damage control and evacuation procedures, even as it became clear the ship could not be saved. Jojima's decision to maintain course and accept his ship's destruction had served Japanese tactical interests perfectly. But the price was his own life, and the lives of most of his crew, a sacrifice that illustrated both the effectiveness of Japanese tactical doctrine and the brutal human cost of that doctrine's execution. The torpedo that struck USS New Orleans at 2328 hours hit forward of turret 2 and detonated with such force that it severed the entire bow section of the ship, 183 feet of the cruiser, including turrets 1 and 2 with their 6 8-inch guns, crew berthing spaces, magazines, and storerooms, separated from the main hull and sank independently. The blast killed 125 sailors instantly, men who had no warning and no time to escape the forward compartments as the bow section broke away. Lieutenant Commander Hubert Haverfield, the damage control officer, reached the scene within minutes to find a nightmarish situation, the ship's forward structure ending in a ragged cross-section of torn metal, flooding rushing into spaces that had never been designed to be exposed to the sea, oil from ruptured fuel tanks igniting on the water's surface. New Orleans had been transformed in a single second from a powerful warship to a crippled hulk missing almost a third of her length, with hundreds of her crew dead or fighting for survival in flooded compartments. Aboard Minneapolis, damage control parties struggled with similar devastation, though the damage pattern differed from New Orleans' catastrophic bow loss. The 2 torpedo hits on the flagship had blown off the bow forward to frame 27 and created massive flooding that extended deep into the ship's internal spaces. Water rushed through the torn hull plating, threatening to sink the ship unless damage control teams could seal bulkheads and stabilize the flooding. Yet the forward 8-inch turret was gone, blown overboard, or submerged as the bow settled. Admiral Wright, recovering from the shock of the impacts, faced the immediate question of whether to abandon ship or continue fighting to save her. The damage control reports coming to the flag bridge suggested survival was possible if the flooding could be contained, but Minneapolis could no longer maintain fleet speed and could barely maneuver. Wright ordered the ship to make for Tulagi Harbor, proceeding stern first to keep the damaged bow out of the water, a procedure never practiced in training, but improvised from necessity. The flagship began backing away from the battle at 4 knots, navigating backward through waters that might contain mines, submarines, or additional Japanese ships. As Pensacola was struck at 2339 hours, 12 minutes after Minneapolis' first hit, as the cruiser attempted evasive maneuvers to avoid the torpedo spread. The Type 93 hit on the starboard side, penetrating the fuel tanks and creating an immediate and catastrophic fire. Oil from ruptured tanks spread across the water's surface and ignited, creating flames that rose 500 feet into the air and could be seen for 30 miles. The fire's intensity melted aluminum superstructure, cooked off ready ammunition, and turned the cruiser's midsection into an inferno that threatened magazine detonation. 125 sailors died in the initial explosion and fire, and dozens more suffered burns as they fought to control the flames or evacuated threatened spaces. The ship developed a 13-degree list as counter-flooding measures attempted to balance the weight of flooded compartments, but the list made firefighting more difficult and threatened to capsize the ship if it increased further. Captain Frank Lowe maintained damage control operations while simultaneously considering whether the ship could be saved or whether he should order abandon ship before the fire reached the magazines. The fourth torpedo hit came at 2348 hours when Northampton received 2 Type 93s on her port side amidships. The impacts occurred in quick succession, flooding the engineering spaces and causing immediate power loss. Without power to run pumps, the damage control parties could not counter flood effectively or pump out flooded compartments. The ship began developing a list to port the damage control teams recognized as the beginning of progressive flooding that would eventually capsize the ship. Captain Willard Kitts ordered counter-flooding in starboard compartments to slow the list, but without power the process was manual and slow. By midnight, Northampton's list had reached 23 degrees and was increasing. Kitts faced the grim reality that his ship was dying, despite everything the crew could do to save her. At approximately 0100 hours on December 1st, he ordered abandon ship, beginning the process of evacuating approximately 800 crew members into the shark-infested waters off Guadalcanal, while destroyers moved in to conduct rescue operations. The human cost of these torpedo hits extended far beyond the immediate casualties from explosions and flooding. Sailors trapped in forward compartments as bulkheads were sealed to prevent flooding spread found themselves in complete darkness as power failed, with water rising and no apparent way out. Some of these men drowned in the darkness, their bodies not recovered until the ships reached port and could be properly searched. Others suffered burns from fuel fires or steam from ruptured boilers, injuries that would prove fatal despite medical treatment. Still others faced psychological trauma from the experience of being blown off their feet by impacts thrown against bulkheads, or having to step over bodies of shipmates as they reached their damage control stations. The professional training that made damage control possible, the ability to function amid chaos, to execute procedures despite fear, to prioritize ship survival over personal safety, came at a cost in psychological wounds that many sailors would carry for the rest of their lives. The damage control battle on each ship followed similar patterns but with variations based on the specific damage pattern and the training level of individual crews. Damage control parties identified flooding boundaries, sealed watertight doors and hatches, shored weakened bulkheads with timbers and steel plates, and established pumping chains to remove water from flooded but not completely lost compartments. Fire parties fought blazes with water, foam, and chemicals, and often while wearing breathing apparatus in smoke-filled spaces where visibility was measured in inches. Medical teams set up aid stations to treat casualties, performing triage in darkness or emergency lighting, while the ship shook with damage and maneuvered unpredictably. Throughout all this, officers and petty officers maintained order and discipline, preventing panic and ensuring that damage control procedures were executed properly, even when outcomes remained uncertain. The professionalism and training of American damage control teams, developed through years of peacetime drills and refined by early war experience, was about to be tested to its absolute limits. New Orleans' situation exemplified both the extremity of the damage and the effectiveness of American damage control. Lieutenant Commander Haverfield directed efforts to seal the forward bulkheads where the bow had separated, essentially creating a new bow end from what had been internal structure. Welders worked under combat conditions to seal gaps. Carpenters shored weakened frames, and damage control parties stuffed mattresses and hammocks into gaps to slow flooding. The ship could not steam forward in her damaged condition. The water pressure against the exposed bulkheads would blow them in, but she could maneuver slowly, stern first. New Orleans began backing toward Tulagi at 2 knots, her crew working through the night to keep the ship afloat while making for the relative safety of harbor. The improvised repairs held, and by dawn, the ship was secure enough that immediate sinking was no longer threatened, though she would require months of reconstruction to return to service. Pensacola's fire reached its peak intensity between midnight and 100 hours, with flames visible from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and from other ships dozens of miles away. The damage control battle centered on preventing the fire from reaching the after magazines, which contained hundreds of tons of explosives that would destroy the ship if they detonated. Fire parties flooded the magazines deliberately, sacrificing the ammunition to prevent catastrophic explosion. They also jettisoned ready ammunition from topside mounts, throwing shells overboard to prevent them from cooking off in the heat and creating secondary explosions. The fire eventually came under control around 0200 hours, having burned itself out in some areas and been suppressed by damage control efforts in others. The ship survived, but she was crippled. Her midsection was gutted by fire, her list made normal operations impossible, and she required immediate assistance to make port. Destroyers came alongside to provide firefighting support and to take off non-essential personnel, reducing the strain on damaged life support systems. Minneapolis's stern first transit to Tulagi represented a unique feat of seamanship that would be studied in damage control courses for decades afterward. Captain Charles Rosendahl conned the cruiser backward for approximately 12 miles, using only after engines and steering manually since the forward damage had severed many control connections. The ship maintained 4 knots, fast enough to make progress, but slow enough to avoid creating water pressure that would overwhelm the temporary repairs to forward bulkheads. Lookouts watched for obstacles, submarines, or additional enemy ships, while damage control teams continuously monitored the flooding situation. The entire evolution took approximately 6 hours, during which the crew never relaxed their vigilance or allowed themselves to believe survival was assured. Only when Minneapolis entered Tulagi Harbor at dawn, on December 1st, did the crew allow themselves to believe they had saved their ship. Even then, the damage was so extensive that Minneapolis would require extensive repairs before returning to active service. Northampton's abandoned ship operation proceeded with remarkable order, despite the desperate circumstances. Full destroyers Drayton and Lamson closed to within boat-lowering distance, playing searchlights on the water to help locate survivors while themselves risking submarine attack by remaining stopped. The crew went over the side in organized groups, wearing life jackets, forming chains in the water to help weaker swimmers, and maintaining discipline that prevented the panic that could have turned orderly evacuation into catastrophe. Northampton capsized and sank at approximately 0300 hours on December 1st. Breaking apart as she went down and taking with her any sailors who had been unable to evacuate. The final casualty count showed 58 officers and men lost with the ship, while 773 were rescued by the destroyers, a ratio that reflected the effectiveness of the abandoned ship procedure and the destroyer's rescue operations. Captain Kitts was among the last to leave the ship, following naval tradition, and was rescued by Drayton after spending nearly an hour in the water. The statistical summary of the torpedo attack's effectiveness revealed the devastating success of Japanese Doctrine and the Type 93 torpedo. 4 American heavy cruisers, representing approximately 40,000 tons of warship displacement and mounting 36 8-inch guns, had been put out of action in approximately 20 minutes. 3 would survive, but would require 6 to 12 months of repairs before returning to service. 1 was sinking, taking to the bottom her guns, equipment, and 58 crew members. Total American casualties exceeded 400 killed and 200 wounded, the majority concentrated in the forward sections of ships where torpedoes struck. These losses derived from 44 torpedoes launched by 8 destroyers, of which only a handful, perhaps 6 to 8 based on damage patterns, actually achieved hits. Even with this relatively low hit percentage, the weapon's devastating power had transformed a tactically superior American force into a collection of cripples and 1 sinking ship. The battle that American Doctrine said should have been a decisive victory had instead become one of the worst defeats in American naval history. The damage control battle that began at 2327 hours on November the 30th continued through the night and into the following day. That's a test of seamanship training, and sheer determination that would ultimately save 3 of the 4 torpedoed cruisers. Lieutenant Commander Hubert Haverfield directed New Orleans' damage control efforts from his station near the ship's center, coordinating parties working in the flooded bow section, supervising welding operations to seal bulkheads, and constantly reassessing the ship's stability as weight distribution changed with flooding and counterflooding. His training had included extensive damage control theory, but nothing had fully prepared him for the reality of a ship missing 183 feet of her bow, yet still afloat and maneuverable. The improvised repairs his teams were executing had never been practiced in peacetime drills, and the procedures they developed came from improvisation, engineering knowledge, and desperate innovation. By 0200 hours on December 1st, Haverfield's teams had stabilized the flooding situation enough to believe the ship would survive until reaching port, but continuous monitoring remained essential. Aboard Minneapolis, damage control central coordinated efforts across multiple damaged areas, while simultaneously supporting the ship's stern-first transit to Tulagi. The damage control officer maintained a plot showing flooding extent, bulkhead integrity, list angle, and trim, all the information needed to assess whether the ship would remain afloat and what measures might be required if the situation deteriorated. Reports flowed in from damage control parties throughout the ship. Bulkhead holding at frame 27, counter-flooding complete in compartment A314, pumps established in forward auxiliary machinery space. Each report represented sailors working in dangerous conditions, often in darkness, always aware that a bulkhead failure could flood their compartment and trap them. The coordination of these distributed teams, maintaining situational awareness while directing responses to evolving problems, exemplified the professionalism that American damage control training had instilled. The officers directing these operations made life-and-death decisions continuously: which compartments to flood, which to fight to save, where to concentrate limited resources, when to recommend abandoning spaces that could not be saved. Pensacola's damage control battle centered on the catastrophic fire that threatened to destroy the ship, even though the torpedo hit itself had not created immediately fatal flooding. Fire parties approached the flames from multiple directions, establishing hose lines, deploying foam generators, and coordinating their efforts to prevent the fire from spreading to undamaged sections. The heat was intense enough to melt aluminum ladders and railings, and firefighters worked in breathing apparatus since the smoke made normal breathing impossible. When ship systems failed, pumps losing power, foam generators running dry, the fire parties improvised with bucket brigades, passing water hand to hand from the sea to the fire zone. This manual firefighting was physically exhausting work, and crews rotated through positions to prevent heat exhaustion, while maintaining continuous pressure on the fire. The decision to flood the after magazines removed hundreds of tons of potential explosive threat, but also created stability problems as the weight of water low in the ship increased the list. Damage control teams had to balance firefighting priorities against stability requirements, making decisions that required both technical knowledge and tactical judgment. The abandoned ship operation aboard Northampton demonstrated how training and discipline could save lives even in desperate circumstances. The crew had practiced abandoned ship drills repeatedly during their service, learning procedures for orderly evacuation, life jacket use, and behavior in the water. When the order came at approximately 100 hours, these drills proved their worth. Sailors moved to designated abandoned ship stations, checked their life jackets, and went over the side in organized groups rather than panicking masses. Petty officers maintained control of their sections, ensuring that no one was left behind in evacuated areas and that wounded sailors received assistance. The destroyers conducting rescue operations found survivors in organized groups rather than scattered individuals, making the rescue more efficient and increasing survival rates. The 73% survival rate, 773 rescued from a crew of approximately 830, reflected both the effectiveness of the evacuation and the dangers of abandoning ship at night in waters known to contain sharks. New Orleans' journey to Tulagi Harbor proceeded slowly through the early morning hours of December 1st, with the damaged cruiser maintaining her stern-first course while damage control teams continuously monitored the temporary repairs. The greatest danger came from water pressure against the forward bulkheads, which increased with any forward motion and could blow in the weakened structure that was the only barrier preventing progressive flooding to the entire ship. Captain Clifton Coney maintained strict speed control, never exceeding 4 knots, and made small course corrections carefully to avoid creating additional strain on damaged structure. Lookouts maintained watch for submarines, mines, or additional Japanese ships. Aware that in her damaged condition, New Orleans could neither fight effectively nor evade attack, and the ship's defensive armament remained operational. The after turrets could still fire. Anti-aircraft guns remained manned, but offensive capability was minimal. Dawn brought relief in the form of air cover from Henderson Field and the sight of Tulagi Harbor ahead, but the crew maintained full vigilance until the ship was safely anchored and additional support could arrive. Minneapolis reached Tulagi Harbor shortly after dawn on December 1st, completing her remarkable backward transit without further incident. The ship's arrival revealed the full extent of her damage to observers who had not witnessed the torpedo hits. The bow was simply gone, replaced by a ragged cross-section of torn metal and jury-rigged patches. Naval constructors who examined the damage later calculated that the ship had lost approximately 15% of her length and displacement, yet she had remained afloat and navigable enough to reach port under her own power. The immediate priority became ensuring that temporary repairs would hold, while plans were developed for either local reconstruction or transit to a repair facility. Engineers determined that Minneapolis could not safely make the journey to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast in her current condition. The open ocean's wave action would overwhelm the improvised bow structure. Instead, plans began for constructing a temporary bow in Tulagi that would allow the ship to make passage to more extensive repair facilities. The temporary bow constructed for New Orleans and Tulagi represented both American ingenuity and the desperate shortage of repair facilities in the South Pacific. Without a proper dry dock or extensive construction facilities, engineers designed a bow structure using coconut logs, steel plates, and welded supports. The result was not beautiful and would never be mistaken for permanent construction, but it was functional. It sealed the forward end of the ship sufficiently to allow slow-speed transit to Australia, where proper repair facilities existed. Construction took several weeks, with sailors and civilian workers laboring under tropical conditions to cut coconut logs to size, fabricate steel frameworks, and weld everything into a structure that could withstand ocean passage. The completed temporary bow extended approximately 30 feet forward of the damaged bulkhead, providing minimal streamlining but adequate sealing to prevent flooding. New Orleans would eventually sail over 3,000 miles with this improvised bow, maintaining speeds of 12 to 15 knots and weathering several storms before reaching Sydney and proper repair facilities. Pensacola's fire damage required weeks of work to make the ship seaworthy enough for transit to repair facilities. The midsection where the fire had raged was gutted, with internal structure weakened or destroyed by heat, equipment melted or ruined by flames, and compartments filled with debris from collapsed structures. Repair teams cut away damaged material, shored weakened frames, and sealed compartments that could not be restored to watertight integrity. Thus, the list that had reached 13 degrees during the fire was gradually reduced through careful counter-flooding and ballast management, but the ship never returned to proper trim while in Tulagi. Medical teams treated burn casualties with limited resources, and some sailors were evacuated to shore facilities for treatment that could not be provided aboard ship. The cruiser would eventually make passage to Pearl Harbor for extensive reconstruction, but the immediate priority was stabilizing the ship enough that she would not sink at anchor or during transit to better facilities. The 3 surviving cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola, would each require 6 to 12 months of reconstruction before returning to active service. Minneapolis received a new bow section at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California incompleted by February 1943. New Orleans underwent extensive reconstruction at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington, emerging with not just a new bow, but upgraded radar, fire control systems, and anti-aircraft armament by August 1943. Pensacola's repairs at Pearl Harbor lasted until October 1943, with her midsection completely rebuilt and modern equipment installed. The extended repair periods removed these ships from Pacific Fleet strength during critical months of 1943, when the campaign moved from Guadalcanal to the Central Solomons and beyond. The strategic impact of their loss to the fleet extended far beyond the immediate battle, all affecting force composition for subsequent operations and placing additional burden on other cruisers that had to assume roles these damaged ships could not fill. The sailors who had fought the damage control battle aboard these ships would carry the experience with them through the rest of the war and beyond. Many received medals for their actions during the night of November 30th to December 1st. Navy Crosses for officers who directed damage control under extreme conditions. Bronze Stars for petty officers who led damage control parties. Letters of commendation for sailors who performed exceptionally while fighting fires or flooding. Thus, decorations recognized that saving ships required the same courage and skill as fighting ships, and that the damage controlmen who worked in flooded compartments or burning spaces faced dangers as extreme as those facing gunners or torpedo crews. The institutional lessons from Tassafaronga's damage control battles were incorporated into training programs, ensuring that future damage control teams would benefit from the experience and improvisations developed during this desperate night. The emphasis on damage control training increased throughout the Navy, with more realistic drills, better equipment, and greater respect for the specialists who made ship survival possible. The damaged cruisers anchored at Tulagi Harbor became subjects of intense technical investigation beginning on December 1st, as naval engineers attempted to understand exactly what had hit them. The torpedo damage aboard Minneapolis showed characteristics that initially puzzled the investigators. The hole in the hull measured 24 inches in diameter, substantially larger than the 21-inch diameter expected from the Mark 15 torpedoes that American ships used. The explosive force required to blow off the ship's bow indicated a warhead far more powerful than intelligence estimates suggested Japanese torpedoes carried. Damage analysis teams from the Bureau of Ships began systematic documentation of every torpedo hit, measuring hull dimensions, analyzing blast patterns, calculating explosive yields from structural damage, and attempting to reconstruct the attack geometry from impact locations. And these investigations would eventually provide the physical evidence that finally forced American naval intelligence to acknowledge the truth about Japanese torpedo capabilities. New Orleans provided the most dramatic evidence of Type 93 capabilities. The complete severing of 183 feet of ship structure required explosive force far exceeding what a standard torpedo warhead could deliver. Engineers calculated that approximately 1,000 pounds or more of high explosive would be necessary to create the observed damage pattern, nearly double the Mark 15's warhead weight. The clean separation of the bow section, rather than a ragged tear, suggested a torpedo that detonated with precise contact fusing, rather than the erratic magnetic detonation problems that plagued American weapons. An analysis of where the torpedo hit, forward of turret 2, approximately at the ship's waterline, indicated that the weapon had run at its set depth rather than running deep as Mark 15s frequently did. Every aspect of the damage pattern pointed toward a torpedo substantially more sophisticated and capable than American intelligence had estimated Japanese weapons to be. On December 3rd, damage control teams aboard Pensacola discovered an unexploded Type 93 lodged in the ship's hull, an intelligence windfall that would finally provide definitive evidence of Japanese torpedo capabilities. The weapon had struck the cruiser but failed to detonate, instead embedding itself in the damaged structure where it remained until discovered by repair crews. Ordnance disposal experts carefully extracted the torpedo and transported it to a secure location for examination, aware that they were handling the first intact specimen of the weapon that had caused such devastation. The disassembly and analysis that followed revealed secrets the Japanese Navy had protected for over a decade. The oxygen propulsion system, the sophisticated gyroscope for course control, the large warhead containing Type 97 explosive, and the contact fuse design that explained the weapon's reliable detonation. This single unexploded torpedo provided more accurate intelligence about Japanese torpedo capabilities than all the pre-war reports that had been systematically dismissed. Intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor received the technical data from the Tassafaronga investigations, with reactions ranging from shock to incredulity. The specifications were so far beyond previous estimates that some analysts initially questioned whether the measurements were accurate or whether the captured torpedo was some kind of experimental model rather than standard equipment. Cross-referencing with pre-war reports, however, revealed an uncomfortable truth. The intelligence community had received accurate information about Type 93 capabilities multiple times between 1937 and 1942, and had dismissed every report as implausible or exaggerated. The 1937 report from the Shanghai Observer describing 18,000-yard torpedo attacks was retrieved and reviewed. It had been accurate. British reports from Malaya about long-range torpedo attacks on HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were re-examined. They had described Type 93 characteristics precisely. Multiple reports from early Pacific War engagements describing impossibly long-range torpedo hits were pulled from the files, all consistent with Type 93 capabilities. The pattern was damning. American intelligence had not lacked information about Japanese torpedoes, but had systematically refused to believe information that contradicted their assumptions about Japanese technological limitations. The reconstruction of torpedo tracks from damage patterns aboard the four cruisers provided additional disturbing evidence about the battle's dynamics. By working backward from impact locations and timing, analysts calculated where the torpedoes must have been launched to achieve those hits. The ranges exceeded 20,000 yards in several cases, more than twice what American Doctrine considered the maximum effective torpedo range. The torpedo run times, 7 to 9 minutes from launch to impact for the closer targets, explained why American lookouts had not provided effective warning. By the time torpedoes became visible, they were in their terminal runs with only seconds before impact. The spread patterns showed sophisticated fire control, with torpedoes distributed across the width of the American formation's projected position, rather than concentrated on single targets. Everything about the attack geometry demonstrated a level of torpedo warfare capability that exceeded anything American planners had prepared for or even considered possible. The cultural and institutional factors that had led to systematic underestimation of Japanese capabilities became subjects of uncomfortable examination. Western assumptions about Japanese technological sophistication were revealed as both racist and dangerous. The belief that Asian peoples could not master advanced technology had no basis in fact, but had powerfully influenced intelligence assessments. The institutional conservatism of intelligence analysis, and in where existing estimates were defended against contradictory evidence rather than revised based on new information, had created self-reinforcing errors. The tendency to dismiss field reports from observers who lacked technical expertise had meant that accurate observations were discounted in favor of theoretical assessments by analysts who had never seen the weapons in action. These institutional and cultural failures had contributed directly to tactical decisions at Tassafaronga that placed American cruisers in optimal position to be torpedoed by weapons American Doctrine said could not reach them. The Bureau of Ordnance finally acknowledged the Mark 15 torpedo's deficiencies in the aftermath of Tassafaronga, though the Bureau's resistance to admitting problems had lasted nearly a year despite mounting evidence. Submarine commanders had been reporting depth-keeping failures, magnetic exploder malfunctions, and contact fuse failures since the war's opening months. Surface ship commanders had experienced similar problems, but with less detailed documentation, since tracking individual torpedo performance in surface combat was more difficult than in submarine attacks. The Bureau's standard response had been to blame operator error, suggest that commanders needed better training, and defend the weapon's theoretical design. Tassafaronga provided undeniable evidence that American torpedoes were inferior to Japanese weapons in nearly every measurable parameter: range, speed, warhead power, reliability, and effectiveness. The Bureau could no longer sustain the fiction that the Mark 15 was adequate or that reported problems were isolated incidents rather than systematic failures. The technical bulletin distributed fleet-wide in early 1943 represented a complete reversal of previous intelligence assessments about Japanese torpedo capabilities. The bulletin provided accurate specifications for the Type 93, 24-inch diameter, 1,080-pound warhead, 40,000-yard range at 36 knots, or 22,000-yard range at 49 knots, oxygen propulsion leaving minimal wake, sophisticated gyroscopic control for accurate straight runs. It warned commanders that Japanese destroyers could launch effective torpedo attacks from ranges previously considered safe, or that multiple torpedoes in the water could be assumed even when wakes were not visible, and that closing to traditional gun range against Japanese destroyers meant entering their optimal torpedo engagement zone. The bulletin essentially invalidated the tactical doctrine that had guided American surface forces at Tassafaronga and required fundamental rethinking of how to engage Japanese forces in night combat. The fact that this information came in early 1943 rather than in 1941 or earlier represented an intelligence failure that had cost hundreds of lives and multiple ships. The physical evidence from Tassafaronga, the damaged cruisers, the unexploded torpedo, and the measurements and calculations provided incontrovertible proof that forced institutional acknowledgement of failures that should have been recognized years earlier. The Navy's response combined defensive justifications. Japanese security had been effective, the reports had been ambiguous, the evidence had been insufficient, with genuine efforts to ensure the mistakes would not be repeated. New procedures for intelligence assessment emphasized multiple source confirmation, physical evidence when possible, and willingness to challenge existing estimates when field reports suggested they were incorrect. The cultural assumption that dismissed Japanese technological capabilities as inferior received official repudiation, though changing ingrained attitudes would prove more difficult than changing official policy. The institutional tendency to discount field reports in favor of theoretical analysis was addressed through better integration of combat experience into intelligence assessments. These reforms came too late to prevent Tassafaronga, but would influence intelligence operations for the war's remainder. The broader lesson from Tassafaronga's forensic analysis extended beyond the specific case of Japanese torpedoes to fundamental questions about how military organizations process information and update their understanding when confronted with evidence that contradicts established beliefs. The intelligence failure was not primarily about lack of information, but about institutional resistance to accepting information that challenged comfortable assumptions. This pattern, systematic dismissal of accurate but uncomfortable reports, a defensive protection of existing estimates, cultural bias influencing technical assessments, would prove surprisingly durable despite the devastating evidence from Tassafaronga. Future intelligence failures would demonstrate that changing institutional culture required more than distributing technical bulletins or revising procedures. It required fundamental shifts in how organizations valued different types of evidence and how they responded when reality contradicted expectations. The ships damaged at Tassafaronga provided physical proof of intelligence failure, but whether that proof would translate into lasting institutional reform remained an open question. Admiral Raizo Tanaka regrouped his 7 remaining destroyers in the early morning hours of December 1st, conducting damage assessment and counting the cost of the night's engagement. The destroyer Takanami was gone, lost with most of her crew, a sacrifice that had enabled the rest of the formation to escape and complete their torpedo attack. Several other destroyers had suffered minor damage from American shell hits during the brief gun engagement, but none were seriously impaired. The torpedo attack had achieved devastating results against American cruisers. Lookouts reported multiple large explosions and fires visible for miles, suggesting substantial damage to enemy ships. By the traditional calculus of naval combat, Tanaka had won a decisive tactical victory. 1 destroyer lost versus 4 American cruisers damaged or sunk, a ratio that strongly favored the Japanese. Yet as Tanaka tallied the supply drums that had actually reached Guadalcanal's beaches, the victory's limitations became clear. The primary mission, delivering 1,500 supply drums to the desperate Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal, had failed catastrophically. When American forces appeared on radar at 2306 hours, Tanaka had ordered the immediate jettison of the supply drums to restore his destroyer's combat capability. This decision was tactically sound, preventing the cargo from slowing ships during combat maneuvering, but it meant sacrificing the mission's objective for the tactical opportunity to engage American forces. Of the 1,500 drums loaded aboard the 8 destroyers, only approximately 310 reached Guadalcanal's beaches. Either because some ships had not yet jettisoned all their cargo when Tanaka gave the order, or because currents carried jettisoned drums to shore rather than out to sea. 310 drums represented approximately 20% of the intended delivery, barely enough to sustain the garrison for 2 days rather than the planned 2 weeks. By the metric that mattered strategically, keeping Japanese troops supplied, the mission had been an abject failure. The Japanese troops on Guadalcanal recovering drums from the surf on December 1st morning had no way to know about the tactical victory their navy had won. They saw only the meager 310 drums washing ashore, far below what had been promised and desperately needed. The garrison was already on starvation rations, with men dying daily from malnutrition, disease, any and the cumulative effects of months living under constant bombardment and supply shortage. 2 days' worth of supplies would briefly alleviate the crisis, but would do nothing to address the fundamental problem. American control of the sea and air around Guadalcanal made sustained supply operations nearly impossible. The soldiers opening the drums and distributing their contents, rice, ammunition, medical supplies, understood that their situation was essentially hopeless. The Tokyo Express runs provided psychological relief by demonstrating that they had not been completely abandoned, but the quantities delivered were insufficient to change strategic realities. Tanaka's report to naval headquarters in Rabaul and Tokyo provided a blunt assessment of the strategic situation that his superiors did not want to hear. He acknowledged the tactical success in damaging American cruisers, but emphasized that this success came at the cost of mission failure. He noted that the Tokyo Express could achieve tactical victories in naval engagements, but could not deliver sufficient supplies to sustain the Guadalcanal garrison. He argued that continuing to risk destroyers on supply runs that achieved minimal results made no strategic sense when those destroyers would be needed for future operations. Most controversially, he suggested that the Navy should acknowledge that Guadalcanal could not be held and should focus resources on more defensible positions. This assessment reflected tactical realism, but was politically unacceptable to leaders who had committed enormous prestige and resources to the Guadalcanal campaign and who could not admit failure without severe political consequences. The institutional response to Tanaka's realistic but pessimistic assessment demonstrated how difficult it was for military organizations to acknowledge strategic failure even when confronted with clear evidence. Senior officers in Rabaul praised Tanaka's tactical performance at Tassafaronga, while ignoring his strategic conclusions. Naval staff in Tokyo celebrated the damage inflicted on American cruisers, while avoiding serious discussion of whether the Tokyo Express could actually accomplish its stated mission of sustaining the Guadalcanal garrison. Yet the emphasis on tactical success served to obscure strategic failure, creating a narrative where the Navy was winning battles while the Army was losing the campaign. This division of responsibility allowed each service to avoid confronting the fundamental problem. Japan lacked the resources to sustain operations in the Solomons against growing American strength. Tanaka's blunt assessments threatened this comfortable fiction and made him increasingly unpopular with superiors who preferred optimistic reports to realistic analyses. The supply statistics from November and December 1942 told a story of systematic failure that tactical victories like Tassafaronga could not alter. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal required approximately 500 tons of supplies monthly to maintain combat effectiveness. In November, Tokyo Express runs had delivered approximately 500 tons total, barely adequate for 1 month's needs, but achieved through approximately 10 successful runs that risked dozens of destroyers. In December, deliveries dropped to less than 200 tons as American air power increased and naval interceptions became more frequent. By January 1943, deliveries would approach zero as the Tokyo Express effectively ceased operations. These numbers made clear that Tassafaronga's tactical success, damaging 4 American cruisers, did nothing to solve the fundamental problem of how to supply an isolated garrison surrounded by enemies controlling both sea and air. The battle had been a tactical masterpiece and a strategic irrelevance. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo reached the decision to abandon Guadalcanal in late December 1942, approximately 1 month after the Battle of Tassafaronga. The decision followed extensive debate between services and consideration of multiple factors. American air power from Henderson Field made daylight naval operations suicide. American naval forces were growing stronger as new ships arrived while Japanese forces were depleting, and the garrison on Guadalcanal was dying from starvation and disease faster than combat could kill them. The Emperor's approval of Operation KE, the evacuation of Guadalcanal, came on December 31st, 1942, setting in motion one of the most successful evacuations of the war, but also acknowledging that Japan's first major defensive operation had failed. Tanaka's pessimistic assessment after Tassafaronga had proven correct, but this vindication brought him no satisfaction and no professional advancement. The evacuation of Guadalcanal between February 1st and 7th, 1943, demonstrated Japanese naval skill, but also highlighted the desperation of the strategic situation. Destroyers conducted 3 high-speed runs to Cape Esperance, evacuating approximately 10,652 soldiers under cover of diversionary operations that convinced American forces the Tokyo Express was continuing supply operations. The evacuation was tactically brilliant. Most soldiers were removed with minimal losses, but strategically devastating. Japan was yielding an island that had cost perhaps 31,000 casualties, the majority from starvation and disease. The survivors evacuated were often in terrible physical condition, requiring extensive medical treatment before they could be considered for future operations. The campaign had consumed enormous naval resources, dozens of ships sunk or damaged, hundreds of aircraft lost, and had achieved nothing except delaying American advance by approximately 6 months. Tassafaronga's tactical victory had bought time for this evacuation, but had not changed the campaign's ultimate outcome. Tanaka's relief from command came in February 1943, framed officially as routine rotation, but understood by all involved as punishment for his pessimistic assessments and blunt communications with superiors. He was reassigned to shore duty in Burma, far from the naval operations where his expertise would be most valuable. The official reason cited health issues and the need for rest after months of intense operations, but the reality was institutional punishment for an officer who had told uncomfortable truths rather than providing reassuring optimism. Tanaka's relief sent a message throughout the Japanese Navy about the career risks of providing realistic assessments that contradicted official optimism. Officers learned that tactical competence would be rewarded, but strategic pessimism would be punished, creating incentives for reporting that emphasize positive aspects while minimizing or concealing problems. This institutional culture would contribute to continued strategic failures as the war progressed. The broader lesson from Tanaka's experience at Tassafaronga was that tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic impossibility. His destroyer force had executed their mission brilliantly, sinking or crippling 4 American cruisers while losing only 1 destroyer. By any reasonable tactical standard, this represented an overwhelming victory, a demonstration of superior doctrine, training, and weapons employment. Yet the victory accomplished nothing of strategic value because the strategic situation was fundamentally untenable. Guadalcanal could not be held regardless of how many Tokyo Express runs were conducted or how many American ships were sunk, because the underlying balance of forces, particularly American air power from Henderson Field, made sustained Japanese operations impossible. Tactical victories provided morale benefits and delayed American advances, but could not alter the strategic trajectory of the campaign. Tanaka understood this reality and paid a professional price for stating it clearly, while officers who emphasized tactical success while ignoring strategic failure maintained their positions and influence. Rear Admiral Carleton Wright faced the morning of December 1st, 1942, from the damaged bridge of USS Minneapolis as the cruiser anchored in Tulagi Harbor. His flagship had survived the night, but at tremendous cost. The bow blown off, 37 men dead. The ship crippled and barely navigable. 3 other cruisers under his command were similarly damaged or sinking, and Wright understood that he would be called upon to explain how a force with overwhelming firepower superiority had been devastated in less than 30 minutes of combat. Or the after-action report he would need to write represented more than administrative obligation. It would determine how the Navy understood this defeat, whether lessons would be learned or blame simply assigned. Wright had commanded Task Force 67 for exactly 48 hours before the battle, inheriting ships he had never worked with and executing doctrine he had been trained to follow. Now he would be judged for the results. The composition of Wright's after-action report proceeded over the following days as damage control efforts continued and the full extent of the disaster became clear. He described the detection of Japanese forces at 2306 hours, the decision to close to gun range following standard doctrine, the authorization for destroyer torpedo attack at 2316 hours, and the opening of cruiser gunfire at 2321 hours. He detailed the concentration of fire on Takanami and the subsequent torpedo hits that crippled his formation. The report was factual and professional, but it could not fully capture the impossible situation Wright had faced. Commanding unfamiliar ships, following doctrine that placed American cruisers in optimal position for Japanese torpedo attack, operating without accurate intelligence about enemy capabilities. The report concluded with recommendations for changes to doctrine and requests for better intelligence about Japanese weapons. But Wright understood that these recommendations would not shield him from blame for the defeat. Admiral William Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces, summoned Wright to Noumea for a personal accounting on December 3rd. The meeting was tense and uncomfortable, with Halsey interrogating Wright about every decision made during the battle. Why had the destroyer torpedo attack been delayed for 10 minutes? Why had the cruisers closed to gun range rather than standing off? Why had fire been concentrated on a single destroyer rather than distributed across the formation? Wright's answers emphasized that he had followed established doctrine, that he had acted on the intelligence available to him, and that the unexpected capabilities of Japanese torpedoes had fundamentally altered the tactical equation. Halsey listened but remained unsatisfied, recognizing that explanations about following doctrine provided no comfort to the families of 400 dead sailors or to a Navy that had just lost another significant portion of its cruiser strength. The meeting ended without resolution, with Halsey promising to review the matter further, and Wright returning to his damaged flagship, knowing his career hung in balance. The political dimension of the Tassafaronga defeat extended far beyond Wright's personal fate to questions about American naval leadership and doctrine. Fleet Admiral Ernest King in Washington received reports of the battle with barely controlled fury. This was the third major cruiser loss in the Solomons campaign within 4 months. Savo Island in August had cost 4 heavy cruisers. Cape Esperance in October had damaged multiple ships, and now Tassafaronga had crippled or sunk 4 more cruisers. King demanded accountability and explanations, and his legendary temper made clear that someone would pay professionally for these continued defeats. The fact that Tassafaronga occurred just weeks after the hard-fought naval Battle of Guadalcanal, where American forces had finally achieved a clear victory, made the subsequent defeat even more frustrating. King wanted to know why American technological advantages in radar were not translating to consistent tactical success, and why Japanese forces continued to achieve disproportionate results in night engagements. Wright's defense of his actions centered on the argument that institutional failures rather than individual errors had caused the defeat. The 10-minute delay before authorizing destroyer torpedo attack derived from doctrine requiring flag permission. Wright had followed regulations exactly as written. The decision to close the gun range reflected tactical doctrine developed over years of peacetime training and validated by senior officers. The concentration of fire on Takanami followed standard practice of ensuring targets were destroyed rather than merely damaged. The failure to evade Japanese torpedoes resulted from not knowing those torpedoes could be launched from 20,000-yard range, an intelligence failure that no task force commander could have corrected. This defense was factually accurate but politically insufficient. Institutional failures still required individual accountability, and as task force commander, Wright was the natural focus for blame, regardless of whether he personally bore responsibility for the systemic problems that had doomed his mission. The Navy's institutional response to Tassafaronga revealed the tension between assigning blame and learning lessons. Some senior officers argued that Wright should be court-martialed for the defeat, that allowing such losses without severe consequences would undermine discipline and accountability. Others argued that Wright had been placed in an impossible situation, given inadequate intelligence and obsolete doctrine, and that punishing him would obscure the real problems that needed addressing. The compromise solution satisfied neither faction. Wright was quietly relieved of operational command in February 1943 and assigned to training duties at the Naval War College, a position that utilized his experience while removing him from combat operations. He would never hold another operational command during the war, despite serving for more than 20 additional years before retirement. The message was clear. Following bad doctrine did not excuse defeat, and commanders were expected to achieve victory regardless of institutional failures. The comparison between Wright's treatment and that of other commanders who had suffered defeats in the Solomons campaign revealed inconsistencies in how the Navy assigned accountability. Rear Admiral Richmond Turner had lost 4 cruisers at Savo Island, but retained command and continued to high-level positions throughout the war. Rear Admiral Norman Scott had lost ships at Cape Esperance, but was praised for aggressiveness and continued in operational command until killed at the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. If Wright's relief suggested that the Navy's tolerance for defeat had diminished as the war progressed, or that his relative lack of seniority and political connections made him more vulnerable than more established admirals. The perception among junior officers was that Wright had become a scapegoat, blamed for systemic failures that senior leadership should have addressed years before the war began. Wright's personal writings after the war, preserved in archives and memoirs, revealed his complex feelings about Tassafaronga and his subsequent relief. He never blamed the sailors under his command, emphasizing repeatedly that the crews had performed admirably under terrible circumstances. And he acknowledged that the 10-minute delay before authorizing destroyer attack had been crucial, but maintained that following doctrine had been the correct decision at the time, given the information available. He expressed frustration that intelligence failures about Japanese torpedo capabilities had not been corrected despite evidence available before Tassafaronga. Most significantly, he argued that his relief had been inevitable regardless of his actual responsibility, because the Navy needed someone to blame, and a task force commander was the obvious choice. This assessment was probably accurate. Organizational psychology often demands individual accountability for systemic failures, even when such accountability serves more political than practical purposes. The broader question raised by Wright's case was how military organizations should balance accountability with systemic learning. Punishing commanders for following bad doctrine might deter future adherence to doctrine, but could also discourage initiative and risk-taking. Failing to hold commanders accountable for defeats might undermine discipline, but could allow honest assessment of what went wrong without defensive blame shifting. The Navy's handling of Wright suggested an institution struggling with these tensions, unable to fully commit either to protecting him as a victim of systemic failure or to punishing him as responsible commander. The result was a compromise that satisfied procedural requirements while leaving unresolved the deeper questions about how to prevent similar defeats in the future. And that Wright's legacy within the Navy remained ambiguous for decades after Tassafaronga. To some, he represented a competent officer placed in an impossible situation and unfairly blamed for institutional failures. To others, he exemplified the failure of peacetime-trained commanders to adapt to wartime realities, and the necessity of replacing such officers with more aggressive leaders. The truth probably lay between these extremes. Wright was neither incompetent nor particularly exceptional, but rather a professional officer whose moment of command happened to coincide with a confluence of factors: inadequate intelligence, obsolete doctrine, superior enemy weapons that would have challenged any commander. His relief demonstrated that command carried absolute responsibility for results, regardless of circumstances, a principle that had value for maintaining accountability, but that could also obscure the systemic changes necessary for institutional improvement. The ships he had commanded paid the price for lessons the Navy should have learned years earlier, and Wright paid the professional price for being in command when those unlearned lessons finally exacted their cost. The 10 minutes between Commander William Cole's first request to launch torpedoes at 2306 hours and Admiral Wright's authorization at 2316 hours became one of the most analyzed and debated decisions in American naval history. Radio logs from Fletcher and Minneapolis documented the exchange precisely. Cole requesting permission as Japanese contacts appeared at 23,000 yards. Wright's staff deliberating the appropriate response, Cole's repeated request at 2310 hours as range decreased, and Wright's eventual authorization when range had closed to 7,000 yards. During those 600 seconds, the tactical geometry transformed completely. At the opening range, American destroyers launching first might have disrupted Japanese formations before they could effectively respond. At the final range, Japanese destroyers were already positioned to launch their own devastating torpedo attack. The debate over whether those 10 minutes determined the battle's outcome would occupy naval analysts and historians for decades. The doctrine that required destroyer commanders to request permission before launching torpedoes derived from peacetime training and lessons learned from earlier wars. ME centralized fire control maximized coordination in set-piece battles, where formations maneuvered deliberately, and commanders had time to assess situations before committing weapons. The doctrine prevented friendly fire incidents, a real concern when multiple ships operated in proximity and visual identification was difficult. It ensured that destroyer attacks supported overall battle plans rather than individual commanders acting independently in ways that might conflict with flagship intentions. During peacetime exercises conducted in daylight with good visibility and predictable opposition, the doctrine worked admirably. Ships maneuvered in coordination. Fire was distributed according to centralized plans, and results validated the approach. The problem was that peacetime exercises bore little resemblance to nighttime combat against a competent, aggressive enemy employing weapons and tactics that American planners had not anticipated. The comparison with other navies' practices revealed that the American emphasis on centralized control was not universal. The British Royal Navy granted destroyer commanders substantial autonomy to engage targets of opportunity without requiring flag permission for every weapon release. The Japanese Navy's doctrine explicitly encouraged destroyer captains to act independently once battle was joined, trusting their training and tactical judgment rather than requiring centralized approval. Even within the American Navy, there were variations. Aircraft carrier doctrine gave dive bomber and torpedo bomber pilots authority to select targets without requesting permission for every attack. The question was, why surface warfare doctrine maintained requirements for centralized approval when the speed of nighttime surface combat made such centralization potentially fatal? The answer lay partly in institutional conservatism that resisted changing established practices and partly in senior officers' comfort with peacetime doctrine they had trained under for decades. The tactical analysis of what might have happened without the 10-minute delay revealed both the delay's significance and its limitations. If Cole's destroyers had launched torpedoes at 2,306 hours with Japanese forces at 23,000 yards, the weapons would have reached the target area approximately 8 to 10 minutes later, roughly when Japanese destroyers were preparing their own attacks. The Mark 15 torpedoes' known reliability problems meant that achieving hits was uncertain, regardless of launch timing, but launching first might have forced Japanese destroyers to maneuver defensively rather than achieving optimal firing positions. Alternatively, Japanese destroyers might have detected the torpedo attack and launched their own weapons earlier in response, potentially achieving similar results against American cruisers. The counterfactual analysis could not definitively prove that eliminating the delay would have changed the outcome. But it clearly demonstrated that the delay had removed any chance of American destroyers disrupting the Japanese attack before it was launched. The post-battle examination of the permission to fire doctrine led to significant revisions in American tactical procedures. By April 1943, new standing orders authorized destroyer commanders to launch torpedoes against detected enemy forces without requiring specific flag permission in most circumstances. The revised doctrine specified conditions under which destroyers should coordinate with the flagship and conditions where immediate independent action was appropriate. Night combat situations, where rapid decision-making was essential and communication delays could prove fatal, explicitly authorized destroyer commanders to act on their own initiative. The revised doctrine represented a fundamental shift from peacetime centralization toward wartime distributed authority, acknowledging that modern combat speed and complexity exceeded any individual commander's ability to maintain centralized control. The change came too late for Tassafaronga, but influenced dozens of subsequent engagements where American destroyers operated with greater tactical flexibility. The human dimension of the 10-minute delay, the psychological burden on both Wright and Cole, received less attention than the tactical analysis, but was equally significant. Wright had to make the decision knowing that wrong choices could cost ships and lives, but also knowing that his training and doctrine prescribed procedures he was expected to follow. Authorizing torpedo attack too early might waste weapons on targets that visual confirmation had not verified, or risk friendly fire against American ships that radar might have misidentified. Delaying too long clearly risked allowing the enemy to achieve optimal attack positions. The decision required balancing competing concerns with incomplete information under time pressure while shells were flying and ships were maneuvering at high speed. Cole faced similar pressures from a different position. He could see the tactical window closing as range decreased, but he was bound by doctrine and discipline not to act without authorization. The frustration of watching optimal firing opportunities pass while waiting for permission tested the professionalism and restraint that naval training had instilled. The broader institutional question raised by the permission to fire controversy was how military organizations updated doctrine based on operational experience. The American Navy in 1942 possessed a sophisticated system for collecting battle reports, analyzing outcomes, and disseminating lessons throughout the fleet. The problem was that the system worked slowly, often taking months to translate combat experience into revised doctrine and additional months for those revisions to reach operational units. The battles of August through November 1942 in the Solomons had already demonstrated that centralized control created problems in night combat. But the lessons had not been formalized into doctrine changes by the time of Tassafaronga. The delay between identifying problems and implementing solutions meant that ships continued operating under doctrine known to be flawed, and sailors continued dying in situations where better doctrine might have saved them. Accelerating this institutional learning cycle became a priority after Tassafaronga, but acceleration required overcoming bureaucratic inertia, and senior officers' resistance to admitting their favored doctrines were obsolete. The parallel issue of initiative versus discipline in military operations gained new urgency from the permission to fire debate. Military effectiveness required subordinates to follow orders and maintain discipline, but it also required flexibility and initiative when situations changed faster than orders could be updated. Or the 10-minute delay demonstrated what happened when discipline overrode initiative. Cole had the tactical awareness to recognize optimal firing conditions, but lacked authority to act without permission. The question was whether Cole should have launched without authorization, accepting the certain court-martial for disobeying orders against the possibility that his independent action might have changed the battle's outcome. Naval tradition and military law were clear that subordinates followed orders even when they believed those orders were wrong, but Tassafaronga raised uncomfortable questions about whether that principle should be absolute or whether circumstances existed where initiative should override strict obedience. The lessons from Tassafaronga's 10-minute controversy influenced American tactical doctrine through the war's remainder and into the post-war period. The balance between centralized control and distributed initiative became a subject of extensive study at the Naval War College and other professional military education institutions. The general trend was toward greater authorization for independent action by subordinate commanders, particularly in fast-moving combat situations where centralized control was impractical. This shift required cultural changes as well as doctrinal ones. Senior officers had to learn to trust their subordinates' judgment and accept that distributed decision-making would sometimes produce suboptimal outcomes. The alternative, maintaining centralized control that created fatal delays, was clearly worse. But the psychological adjustment of relinquishing control was difficult for commanders trained in peacetime's more deliberate command style. Tassafaronga provided the brutal evidence that forced these changes, making the 10-minute delay a case study in what not to do when tactical circumstances demanded immediate action. The legacy of those 10 minutes extended beyond tactical doctrine to fundamental questions about military professionalism and responsibility. Wright was blamed for the delay, even though he was following established doctrine, while Cole was not criticized for failing to act independently, even though his initiative might have changed the outcome. This distribution of responsibility reflected military culture's emphasis on holding commanders absolutely accountable for results while protecting subordinates who follow orders. Whether this allocation of responsibility served military effectiveness or simply preserved established hierarchies remained debatable. What was clear was that the 10 minutes between 2306 and 2316 hours on November 30th, 1942, demonstrated how doctrine designed for one set of conditions could prove catastrophically inappropriate when conditions changed, and how institutional inertia could prevent necessary updates until failure forced change. The sailors who died at Tassafaronga paid the price for lessons that could have been learned earlier, at lower cost, if the institution had been more responsive to evidence that its peacetime doctrine was unsuited for wartime reality. The Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. They received USS New Orleans in March 1943, and within days the damaged cruiser was surrounded by workers beginning the process of rebuilding her shattered bow. The shipyard employed thousands of workers, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, carpenters, and specialists in dozens of trades, who worked in shifts around the clock to repair battle damage and return ships to the fleet. For New Orleans, the repair was not simply restoration, but reconstruction. engineers designed a completely new bow section, extending 183 feet forward, incorporating the latest radar and fire control equipment, upgrading anti-aircraft armament, and improving damage control features based on lessons learned from the torpedo hit. The work would take 5 months and consume millions of dollars, but the result would be a cruiser more capable than before the damage. This pattern, ships returning from battle damage not just repaired but improved, exemplified American industrial capacity's overwhelming advantage over Japan's more limited resources. The simultaneous reconstruction of Minneapolis at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California and Pensacola at Pearl Harbor demonstrated the American repair infrastructure's scale. Mare Island fabricated a completely new bow for Minneapolis, utilizing designs refined during New Orleans' repair, and completed the work by February 1943. Pensacola's fire damage required essentially gutting her entire midsection and rebuilding internal structure, a process that lasted until October 1943. During these same months, American shipyards were also building new cruisers. Baltimore-class heavy cruisers mounting 9 8-inch guns and improved turrets, Cleveland-class light cruisers with 12 6-inch guns and the latest radar systems. The industrial capacity that could simultaneously repair 3 heavily damaged cruisers while building 13 new cruisers represented an advantage that no tactical excellence could overcome. Japan simply could not match this productivity, regardless of how effectively their forces performed in individual battles. The upgrades incorporated into the repaired cruisers illustrated how American industry translated combat experience into improved capabilities. New Orleans emerged from Puget Sound with SK air search radar that could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. ARI improved SG surface search radar with better discrimination against sea clutter and rain, updated fire control computers that could calculate firing solutions more rapidly and accurately, and additional 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns to counter the growing threat from Japanese air attack. The ship's damage control features included improved compartmentalization, better pumping systems, and enhanced firefighting equipment based on analysis of what had worked and what had failed during the desperate damage control battle after the torpedo hit. Minneapolis and Pensacola received similar upgrades, emerging from their reconstructions as more formidable warships than they had been before Tassafaronga. The investment in repair thus became investment in capability improvement, all turning battle damage into opportunity for modernization. The Japanese situation contrasted starkly with American industrial abundance. The destroyer Takanami, sunk at Tassafaronga, could not be replaced. Japan's shipbuilding capacity was fully committed to constructing aircraft carriers, battleships, and submarines considered more critical than destroyers. The experienced torpedo crews who died aboard Takanami represented an even more irreplaceable loss. Training sailors to operate Type 93 torpedoes effectively required 2 years or more of intensive practice in fire control calculations, equipment maintenance, and tactical employment. Japan could build new destroyers given sufficient time and resources, but creating new expert torpedo crews required time that the war's accelerating pace would not provide. And every experienced petty officer or chief petty officer lost in battle represented years of training investment that could not be quickly recovered. The American advantage in industrial capacity was matched by an advantage in personnel depth. American losses could be replaced from a much larger population with extensive training infrastructure, while Japanese losses progressively degraded capabilities that could not be reconstituted. The production statistics from 1943 revealed the magnitude of the industrial imbalance. American shipyards launched approximately 1 major warship every 3 days throughout the year. New battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines entering the fleet at a pace that exceeded losses by wide margins. Japanese production, already lower at the war's start, declined through 1943 as raw material shortages, bombing of industrial facilities, and allocation of resources to defensive priorities reduced shipyard output. By late 1943, American naval tonnage under construction exceeded the total tonnage of the Japanese Navy, and that construction was proceeding faster than Japan could sink ships even if every Japanese tactical success achieved Tassafaronga-level results. The strategic implication was inescapable. Japan was losing a war of attrition that no amount of tactical excellence could reverse. The human dimension of this industrial disparity was evident in the experiences of sailors aboard the repaired cruisers. Many of Minneapolis's crew remained with the ship during her reconstruction. And they witnessed firsthand the transformation from damaged hulk to improved warship. They saw hundreds of civilian workers swarming over the ship, cutting away damaged structure, welding new steel, installing equipment, and working with an urgency and competence that impressed even veteran sailors. The shipyard workers knew that speed mattered. Every day a ship spent in repair was a day it could not fight, and they approached reconstruction with the same intensity that combat sailors approach battle. The partnership between military personnel who understood what combat required and civilian workers who possessed the skills to build and repair created a synergy that Japan, with its more rigid divisions between military and civilian sectors, found difficult to replicate. The strategic question facing Japanese planners by mid-1943 was whether tactical victories like Tassafaronga served any meaningful purpose when the underlying industrial balance was so unfavorable. Sinking 4 American cruisers removed them from the fleet for 6 to 12 months, but did not fundamentally alter the naval balance because new cruisers were joining the fleet at a faster rate than old ones were being damaged. The Type 93 torpedo's tactical effectiveness was undeniable, but effectiveness in individual engagements could not compensate for quantitative inferiority that grew worse each month. Some Japanese naval officers argued that the solution was even more aggressive tactical employment, seeking decisive battle that would sink American ships faster than they could be replaced. Others argued that conservation of force made more sense, avoiding attritional battles that Japan could not win in favor of defensive operations that might delay American advances. Neither strategy addressed the fundamental problem that industrial capacity rather than tactical excellence would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The American awareness of industrial advantage influenced strategic decisions in ways both obvious and subtle. Commanders knew that damaged ships could be repaired, lost ships could be replaced, and casualties could be made good from reserves that seemed inexhaustible compared to Japanese limitations. This knowledge encouraged aggressive tactics and acceptance of casualties that might have been unacceptable for a nation with more constrained resources. The willingness to trade losses for tactical gains, to accept damage in pursuit of objectives, to continue offensive operations despite setbacks. All these reflected confidence in industrial backing that would ultimately restore and exceed whatever capabilities were temporarily lost. This strategic confidence contrasted sharply with Japanese awareness that every loss was harder to replace, and that the trajectory of industrial production favored the enemy increasingly over time. The question of whether industrial capacity made tactical skill irrelevant received partial answer at Tassafaronga. Japanese tactical excellence had achieved remarkable results, 4 cruisers crippled or sunk in exchange for 1 destroyer lost. But those results had not changed strategic realities on Guadalcanal or in the broader Solomons campaign. American industry would repair the damaged cruisers, or build new ones to replace losses, and maintain naval strength sufficient to support continued offensive operations. Japanese tactical victories provided morale benefits and delayed American advances, but could not alter the fundamental trajectory of a war in which one side could build ships and train sailors faster than the other could sink or kill them. The lesson was sobering but clear. Tactical excellence mattered and could influence individual battles, but strategy and industrial capacity determined which side would ultimately prevail. The sailors at Tassafaronga had fought with skill and courage on both sides, but the outcome of their individual battle mattered less than the broader context of industrial and demographic advantages that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The 3 cruisers damaged at Tassafaronga, Minneapolis, at New Orleans, and Pensacola all returned to service in 1943 and participated in subsequent operations through the war's end. They fought at the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa, their crews applying lessons learned from Tassafaronga and benefiting from the improved equipment their reconstructions had provided. The fact that these ships survived, were repaired, and contributed to ultimate victory illustrated American industrial resilience. The fact that Japan could achieve tactical victory at Tassafaronga but could not prevent these ships' return to service illustrated the limits of tactical success, absent strategic advantage. The arsenal of democracy, whatever its tactical shortcomings in individual battles, possessed depth and resilience that tactical excellence alone could not overcome. This reality, more than any single battle's outcome, would determine the Pacific War's ultimate result. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal operated at near maximum capacity by early December 1942, with aircraft landing and taking off at intervals measured in minutes rather than hours. Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force squadrons shared the facility. F-4, F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and P-38 Lightning fighters, creating a concentration of American air power that dominated the skies within a 200-mile radius. The Japanese forces on Guadalcanal could hear the aircraft overhead constantly, a reminder that American control of the air meant that daylight naval operations were suicide and that supply delivery required risky nighttime runs like the Tokyo Express. The approximately 6,000 tons of supplies that American forces landed monthly at Guadalcanal dwarfed the few hundred tons that Japanese destroyers managed to deliver through increasingly desperate runs down the slot. This disparity in logistics capacity determined Guadalcanal's fate more certainly than any naval battle, including Tassafaronga. The Japanese 17th Army headquarters on Guadalcanal compiled casualty statistics in early December that painted a grim picture of the garrison's condition. Approximately 2,000 soldiers were dying monthly, but fewer than 20% of these deaths resulted from combat with American ground forces. The rest died from starvation, malaria, dysentery, and other diseases that flourished in the tropical environment among malnourished troops lacking adequate medical care. Or the soldiers who remained combat effective numbered perhaps 8,000 from an original garrison that had exceeded 20,000 at its peak, and even these effective soldiers were weakened by months of inadequate rations. The supply drums recovered from the surf after Tassafaronga, 310 containers instead of the promised 1,500, provided 2 days of relief, but did nothing to address the fundamental problem. The mathematics of supply were inexorable. The garrison required approximately 500 tons monthly to maintain strength, but actual deliveries were averaging less than 200 tons and declining as American air and naval forces strengthened. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo received reports from Guadalcanal with growing alarm through December 1942. The Army argued that the Navy had failed to maintain supply lines and should commit greater resources to the Tokyo Express operations. The Navy countered that the Army had underestimated the difficulty of holding an island within range of enemy air power, and that continuing to risk destroyers on supply runs that delivered inadequate quantities made no strategic sense. The inter-service rivalry that had characterized Japanese military planning throughout the war intensified as Guadalcanal's situation deteriorated. The broader strategic question, whether to continue fighting for Guadalcanal or to abandon the island and establish defenses elsewhere, divided senior leadership. Those favoring continued resistance argued that abandoning Guadalcanal would concede the initiative to America and damage morale throughout Japanese forces. Those favoring evacuation argued that bleeding resources to defend an untenable position served no strategic purpose and only delayed the inevitable while consuming forces needed elsewhere. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal, reached in late December and formally approved by the Emperor on December 31, 1942, represented one of the most significant strategic retreats in Japanese military history. The operation received the designation K, and planning proceeded with the same attention to detail that had characterized the initial invasion. The plan called for 3 high-speed destroyer runs to Cape Esperance, timed to exploit periods of limited American air activity, and coordinated with diversionary operations that would convince American forces the Tokyo Express was continuing supply missions. Yet the evacuation success would depend on deception, speed, and the continued effectiveness of Japanese destroyer forces in nighttime operations, despite American improvements in radar and tactics. Admiral Tanaka's pessimistic assessment after Tassafaronga, that Guadalcanal could not be held, had proven correct, though the vindication came too late to save his command or prevent the losses sustained attempting the impossible. Operation K proceeded between February 1st and 7th, 1943, with Japanese destroyers making 3 high-speed runs to evacuate the Guadalcanal garrison. The first run on February 1st removed approximately 5,000 soldiers. The second run on February 4th evacuated approximately 4,000, and the final run on February 7th took off the remaining approximately 1,650 soldiers still capable of evacuation. The operations were tactically brilliant, achieving surprise despite American surveillance and removing soldiers under conditions that should have resulted in significant losses. American forces initially interpreted the destroyer runs as standard Tokyo Express supply missions and focused on interdicting supplies rather than recognizing an evacuation was underway. By the time American commanders realized the Japanese were abandoning the island rather than reinforcing it, most of the garrison had been removed. The success of Operation Kie demonstrated Japanese operational skill, but also highlighted the strategic failure that had made evacuation necessary. The soldiers evacuated from Guadalcanal required extensive medical treatment and rest before they could be considered for future operations. Many suffered from severe malnutrition. Average weight loss exceeded 30 pounds per man, and some had lost 50 pounds or more. Tropical diseases including malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever affected nearly every evacuee, with some requiring hospitalization for months. Psychological trauma from months of constant bombardment, starvation, and watching comrades die from disease created mental health challenges that Japanese military medicine was ill-equipped to address. The survivors represented a fraction of the forces originally committed to Guadalcanal, and even these survivors would require months to recover combat effectiveness. The human cost of attempting to hold an untenable position exceeded the material cost in ships and aircraft, though both costs were significant. The casualty accounting for the Guadalcanal campaign revealed strategic failure's price. Japanese forces suffered approximately 31,000 casualties total, including approximately 25,000 dead. American forces suffered approximately 7,000 casualties, including approximately 1,600 dead. Still significant losses, but far lower than Japanese casualties. The disproportion reflected the fundamental imbalance in logistics. American forces were well supplied, well fed, and received regular medical care, while Japanese forces starved, sickened, and died without adequate support. The Tokyo Express runs, including Tassafaronga's tactical victory, all had delivered insufficient supplies to alter this basic reality. Naval battles might achieve tactical success, but they could not compensate for the logistics disparity that determined which side's soldiers would be fed, healthy, and capable of sustained combat operations. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal's loss reverberated through Japanese planning for the remainder of the war. The campaign had demonstrated that American industrial and logistical capacity could support offensive operations even in remote locations far from American bases. It had shown that American forces could establish air superiority and use that superiority to interdict Japanese supply lines regardless of Japanese tactical skill in naval combat. It had proven that tactical excellence, exemplified by battles like Tassafaronga, could not compensate for strategic disadvantages in logistics and air power. These lessons should have informed subsequent Japanese defensive planning, but institutional and cultural factors made learning from defeat difficult. The emphasis remained on seeking decisive battle, rather than acknowledging that attrition favored America and that defensive strategies should focus on delaying rather than defeating American advances. The irony of Tassafaronga's timing, occurring just 6 weeks before Japan decided to abandon Guadalcanal, was not lost on officers who had participated in the battle. The tactical victory had achieved nothing of strategic value because the strategic situation was already hopeless. It's the supplies that failed to reach Guadalcanal would not have changed the outcome even if delivered in full. The American cruisers damaged at Tassafaronga would be repaired and returned to service in time to participate in subsequent campaigns. The Japanese destroyer lost, Takanami, could not be replaced with equivalent capability. The battle that had seemed like a significant victory in the immediate aftermath proved to be a tactical success within a strategic defeat, demonstrating that winning battles mattered far less than winning campaigns. The soldiers abandoned on Guadalcanal when evacuation proved impossible, left behind because they were too sick or wounded to move, became a grim reminder that tactical excellence could not prevent strategic failure's human cost. The American perspective on Guadalcanal's conclusion mixed relief at the campaign's end with frustration that Japanese forces had escaped relatively intact. The discovery on February 9th that Japanese forces had evacuated came as a surprise to American commanders, who had expected to fight a final battle for the island. The realization that Operation K had succeeded under their observation was embarrassing professionally, though strategically, it mattered little whether the Japanese garrison was captured or evacuated. Either way, Guadalcanal was secured. The island would become a major American base supporting subsequent operations in the Solomons, with Henderson Field expanded and additional airfields constructed. The logistics infrastructure that had supported American operations during the campaign would be enhanced to support offensive operations northward. Guadalcanal transformed from contested battleground to secure rear area, enabling the next phase of the Pacific Campaign's island-hopping strategy. The question of what Tassafaronga had accomplished within the broader Guadalcanal campaign received various answers depending on perspective. From a narrow tactical view, the battle was a significant Japanese victory that inflicted disproportionate losses on American forces. From a strategic view, the battle was irrelevant to campaign outcome, since Guadalcanal was lost, regardless of Tassafaronga's result. The supplies that failed to reach shore would not have changed the garrison's fate. The American cruisers' damage would be repaired and returned to fight subsequent battles. The battle had demonstrated Japanese tactical excellence and American doctrinal failings, lessons that would influence future engagements. But it had not changed strategic realities or altered the campaign's trajectory. The Battle of Tassafaronga would be remembered as a tactical masterpiece and a strategic footnote, significant for what it taught about night combat, but ultimately irrelevant to Guadalcanal's fate and the broader course of the Pacific War. The Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, conducted a war game in March 1943 that replayed the Battle of Tassafaronga with one critical difference. The American side possessed accurate intelligence about Japanese Type 93 torpedo capabilities. The officers playing American commanders maneuvered their cruiser formation to maintain range beyond 20,000 yards, prevented their destroyers from closing to traditional torpedo range, and used radar-directed gunfire to engage Japanese destroyers from standoff distance. The result was substantially different from the historical battle. American forces inflicted damage while avoiding catastrophic torpedo hits. The war game demonstrated that accurate intelligence might have changed tactical decisions, but it also revealed a more uncomfortable truth. Even with perfect intelligence, American doctrine would have required substantial revision to counter Japanese capabilities effectively. The lessons from Tassafaronga went beyond simple intelligence failures to fundamental questions about how American naval forces prepared for and conducted night combat. The systematic analysis of Tassafaronga identified 6 critical doctrinal failures that had contributed to the defeat. First, the underestimation of Japanese torpedo capabilities had led to tactical decisions that placed cruisers within enemy weapon range while believing they were safely beyond it. Second, the centralized fire control doctrine requiring destroyer commanders to request permission before launching torpedoes had created fatal delays. Third, the emphasis on closing to gun range reflected peacetime training that assumed torpedoes were short-range weapons, and that cruiser firepower superiority would be decisive at close range. Fourth, odds-inadequate night combat training had left crews unprepared for the visual confusion and rapid decision-making required in darkness. Fifth, over-reliance on radar as a complete replacement for visual observation rather than a supplement to it had created blind spots in American tactical awareness. Sixth, poor integration between destroyers and cruisers resulted in the two ship types operating semi-independently rather than as coordinated teams. Addressing these failures required comprehensive revision of American surface warfare doctrine. The Mark 15 torpedoes' deficiencies finally received official acknowledgement in the months following Tassafaronga, though the Bureau of Ordnance's resistance to admitting problems had delayed this recognition for over a year. Submarine commanders had been reporting depth-keeping failures, its magnetic exploder malfunctions and contact fuse failures since December 1941, but the Bureau had consistently blamed operator error rather than design flaws. Surface ship commanders reported similar problems, but with less systematic documentation, since tracking individual torpedo performance in the chaos of surface combat was more difficult than in deliberate submarine attacks. The concentration of evidence from multiple sources, submarines, surface ships, and post-battle analysis, finally overcame bureaucratic resistance. The Bureau initiated redesign of the Mark 15's depth-keeping mechanism, eliminated the magnetic exploder after determining it could not be made reliable, and improved the contact fuse to prevent the pin-bending failures that had caused so many torpedoes to fail to detonate on impact. IPOM, the new tactical doctrine distributed fleet-wide in the mid-1943, represented fundamental shifts in how American surface forces would conduct night combat. Destroyers received authorization to launch torpedoes without requiring flag permission in most combat situations, with standing orders that specified circumstances requiring coordination and circumstances allowing independent action. Cruiser formations were instructed to maintain standoff ranges against enemy destroyers rather than closing to traditional gun range, using radar-directed fire from 15,000 yards or more rather than visual fire control from 8,000 yards. Night combat training hours increased dramatically, from 12 hours monthly to over 40 hours monthly for ships in combat zones. The training emphasized integration between radar detection and visual confirmation rather than relying on radar alone. Destroyer-cruiser coordination received new emphasis, with exercises practicing coordinated attacks where destroyers screened cruisers while both ship types engaged according to their capabilities rather than operating semi-independently. The cultural changes required to implement new doctrine proved as challenging as the tactical revisions themselves. Senior officers who had trained under peacetime doctrine for decades had to acknowledge that their favored tactics were obsolete and that younger officers' suggestions for change had merit. The peacetime emphasis on precision formation keeping and centralized control had to give way to more flexible formations and distributed decision-making. Now, the assumption that technological superiority in radar would automatically translate to tactical success had to be replaced with recognition that technology was a tool requiring proper employment rather than a guarantee of victory. These cultural shifts required more than distributing new tactical manuals. They required senior leadership willing to admit that pre-war training had been inadequate and that combat experience was forcing painful institutional learning. The comparison between American and Japanese night combat doctrine after Tassafaronga revealed how differently the two navies approached tactical problems. Japanese doctrine emphasized distributed control with individual ship captains exercising substantial initiative, while revised American doctrine moved toward distributed control but maintained more coordination requirements. Japanese doctrine prioritized torpedo attacks from maximum range followed by disengagement, while American doctrine increasingly emphasized radar-directed gunfire from standoff range with torpedoes as supplementary weapons. Japanese training focused on night vision development and optical equipment proficiency, while American training emphasized radar operation and visual radar integration. Neither doctrine was objectively superior in all circumstances, but each reflected different assessments of available technology, weapons capabilities, and tactical priorities. The key difference was that American doctrine could evolve based on combat experience, while Japanese doctrine remained relatively static, partly because Japanese tactical success at battles like Tassafaronga reinforced existing approaches rather than forcing reassessment. The timeline for implementing doctrinal changes demonstrated both the American Navy's responsiveness to combat lessons and the inevitable delays in translating analysis into fleet-wide practice. The initial after-action reports from Tassafaronga reached Washington in early December 1942. Analysis at the Naval War College and in various staff sections proceeded through December and January. Draft doctrine revisions were prepared in February and March 1943. Fleet-wide distribution of new standing orders occurred in April through June. Implementation in actual combat operations required additional months as ships conducted training exercises and commanders internalized new procedures. By late 1943, approximately 1 year after Tassafaronga, the new doctrine was widely implemented and showing results in improved combat performance. This timeline was actually relatively rapid by bureaucratic standards, but it still meant that ships operated under doctrine known to be flawed for months, while revisions proceeded through official channels. The results of doctrinal revision became evident in subsequent night battles during 1943 and 1944. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943, American destroyers launched torpedoes without requiring flag permission, disrupting Japanese formations before they could achieve optimal attack positions. American cruisers maintained ranges of 15,000 yards or more, using radar-directed gunfire effectively while staying beyond Type 93 range. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American forces demonstrated complete integration of radar detection, visual confirmation, and coordinated destroyer-cruiser operations. The statistics were striking. In night engagements from August through November 1942, Japanese forces achieved victory approximately 75% of the time. In night engagements from mid-1943 through 1945, American forces achieved victory approximately 85% of the time. This reversal reflected not just improved doctrine, but also growing American advantage in radar quality, increasing numbers of ships, and progressive degradation of Japanese capabilities as experienced crews were lost and could not be adequately replaced. The institutional learning demonstrated by American doctrinal revision after Tassafaronga contrasted with Japanese institutional rigidity that prevented similar adaptation. Japanese forces had won tactical victory at Tassafaronga using doctrine they had perfected over years of training. This success reinforced belief that their approaches were superior and required no fundamental revision. The fact that tactical success had not prevented strategic defeat at Guadalcanal was attributed to factors beyond the Navy's control: Army failures, insufficient resources, impossible missions, rather than prompting reassessment of whether tactical excellence could compensate for strategic disadvantages. The Japanese Navy continued emphasizing night torpedo attacks, using Type 93 weapons through 1943 and beyond, achieving occasional tactical successes, but finding that American countermeasures were increasingly effective. The inability to adapt doctrine when circumstances changed would prove a significant Japanese disadvantage as the war progressed. The question of whether Tassafaronga's lessons could have been learned earlier, before the battle demonstrated their necessity through catastrophic defeat, remained a subject of debate among naval analysts. The Battle of Savo Island in August 1942 had shown that Japanese forces excelled at night combat, but American analysis had attributed that defeat to tactical surprise rather than systematic Japanese advantages in doctrine and weapons. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October 1942 had demonstrated radar's limitations in night combat, but the tactical victory obscured the underlying problems. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 had been too chaotic to provide clear lessons about systematic doctrine failures. Tassafaronga was perhaps the first engagement, where American forces possessed clear radar advantage, enjoyed numerical and firepower superiority, and still suffered decisive defeat due to doctrinal and intelligence failures rather than tactical surprise or individual errors. The defeat was unmistakable, the causes were clear, and the institutional response was finally adequate to the challenge. And whether this required such a catastrophic demonstration, or whether the Navy should have learned from earlier warnings, remained an uncomfortable question about institutional responsiveness to evidence that contradicted established beliefs. The sailors who had survived Tassafaronga and subsequently fought in later battles using revised doctrine recognized the improvement, even if institutional analyses took time to confirm it. They noted that destroyer commanders acted with greater initiative, that cruiser captains maintained safer standoff ranges. That night, combat training had better prepared them for actual combat conditions, that radar and visual lookouts worked as teams rather than competing systems. They also noted that winning battles was easier when doctrine matched tactical realities than when following procedures known to be flawed. The fact that these improvements came too late for the 400 sailors killed at Tassafaronga added bitterness to the recognition that institutional learning had required catastrophic demonstration. The memorial services held for Tassafaronga's casualties included unspoken recognition that these men had died partly because the institution had been slow to learn lessons that combat experience should have taught earlier and at lower cost. The archive room at the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington held filing cabinets containing reports that should have changed American understanding of Japanese torpedo capabilities years before Tassafaronga. A researcher conducting post-battle analysis in January 1943 discovered a report dated October 1937 from the American naval attaché in Shanghai describing an engagement where Chinese cruiser Ping Hai had been struck by a torpedo at a range the observer estimated at 18,000 yards. The report included detailed descriptions of the torpedo's minimal wake and the devastating damage from what appeared to be an unusually large warhead. The attaché's analysis concluded with a notation. Chinese observers likely overestimated range due to combat confusion. Japanese torpedo capabilities assessed as comparable to current American standards. The report had been filed and forgotten, its evidence dismissed as observer error, rather than triggering investigation into whether Japanese torpedoes might possess capabilities exceeding American estimates. The pattern of dismissal repeated itself across multiple reports from 1937 through 1942. British naval observers in Malaya reported in December 1941 that HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse had been struck by torpedoes during attacks that appeared to come from ranges exceeding 12,000 yards. The British analysis suggested these might have been aircraft-launched rather than ship-launched torpedoes, despite witnesses reporting no aircraft in the immediate attack area at the time of some hits. And American intelligence officers reviewing the British reports noted the implausibility of surface-launched torpedoes at such ranges and filed the reports without further investigation. A report from the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942 described Dutch cruisers being hit by torpedoes that approached with almost invisible wakes, but the report attributed this to poor visibility conditions rather than considering that Japanese torpedoes might use propulsion systems different from Western weapons. Each report, viewed individually, could be explained away through alternative interpretations. Viewed collectively, they formed a pattern that should have prompted serious investigation. that the institutional culture within the Office of Naval Intelligence during the late 1930s and early war years systematically discouraged reports that challenged existing estimates. Analysts were evaluated partly on whether their assessments aligned with established positions, and partly on whether they avoided creating unnecessary alarm among operational commanders. A junior analyst suggesting that Japanese torpedoes might possess dramatically superior capabilities to American weapons would have faced skepticism from senior officers who had spent careers believing Western technology was inherently superior to Asian technology. The analyst would need extraordinary evidence to overcome this skepticism, and fragmentary combat reports from chaotic engagements did not meet that standard. The result was institutional bias toward dismissing uncomfortable evidence rather than investigating whether that evidence might reveal systematic gaps in understanding enemy capabilities. The cultural assumptions underlying intelligence dismissals were particularly evident in assessments of Japanese technological capabilities. The prevailing view within American military intelligence held that Japan was a second-tier industrial power capable of copying Western designs, but incapable of original innovation at the frontiers of technology. This view had some basis in Japan's historical pattern of adopting Western technologies during the Meiji Restoration, but it fundamentally underestimated Japanese engineering capabilities by the 1930s. The oxygen-propelled torpedo represented exactly the kind of technological innovation that Western analysts believed Japanese engineers could not achieve, a weapon that Western navies had considered but rejected as impractical due to safety concerns and technical challenges. The fact that Japanese engineers had solved these problems through meticulous development work contradicted assumptions about Japanese technological limitations. Rather than revising the assumptions when evidence accumulated, analysts found ways to explain away the evidence while preserving their comfortable beliefs. The specific case of oxygen torpedo technology illustrated how technical assessment could be corrupted by cultural bias. Western naval experts knew that pure oxygen created explosion hazards during handling and storage, or making oxygen torpedoes theoretically possible but practically dangerous. The consensus among American and British torpedo designers was that the safety risks outweighed performance benefits and that compressed air propulsion was adequate for operational requirements. When reports suggested Japanese torpedoes possessed capabilities consistent with oxygen propulsion, Western analysts concluded that the reports must be inaccurate rather than considering that Japanese engineers might have accepted safety risks Western designers rejected or might have developed safety procedures Western experts had not imagined. The theoretical conclusion, oxygen torpedoes were impractical, overrode empirical evidence that such weapons existed and were being used effectively. This represented fundamental scientific method failure. Theory should be revised when evidence contradicts it, not evidence dismissed when it contradicts theory. The intelligence reorganization that followed Tassafaronga addressed some structural problems while leaving cultural issues largely unchanged. New procedures required multiple source confirmation before dismissing field reports that contradicted existing estimates. Physical evidence from captured equipment received higher priority than theoretical assessments about what enemy technology could achieve. Combat reports from American ships received more systematic analysis and were cross-referenced to identify patterns that individual reports might miss. Intelligence liaison with operational units improved, and creating feedback loops where analysts could learn whether their estimates matched combat reality. These procedural changes represented genuine improvement, but they did not fully address the underlying cultural problem. Institutions naturally resist information that challenges established beliefs, and overcoming this resistance requires not just better procedures, but cultural transformation that values uncomfortable truths over comfortable fictions. The human cost of intelligence failure at Tassafaronga could be quantified with grim precision. 400 American sailors died partly because intelligence analysts had dismissed accurate reports about Japanese torpedo capabilities. The 3 cruisers damaged required 6 to 12 months of repairs, removing them from the fleet during critical campaigns. The tactical advantage Japanese forces enjoyed due to American ignorance of Type 93 capabilities affected multiple battles beyond Tassafaronga. The question of accountability for intelligence failures proved difficult to answer. Individual analysts who had dismissed reports were following institutional culture and guidance from senior officers. Senior officers who had created that culture were operating under assumptions that seemed reasonable given their training and experience. The systemic nature of the failure meant that no single individual could be blamed, even though the collective result was catastrophic. The institutional response focused on improving future performance rather than punishing past errors. A pragmatic choice, but one that left unresolved questions about whether accountability-free failure would simply repeat itself. The comparison with intelligence successes elsewhere in the Pacific War highlighted how organizational culture affected performance. American code-breaking efforts against Japanese naval codes were brilliantly successful, providing strategic warning about enemy intentions and enabling tactical advantages at battles like Midway. Photographic reconnaissance and analysis identified Japanese ship movements and base developments with impressive accuracy. But technical intelligence about enemy weapons capabilities remained weak throughout the early war years, with assessments of Japanese aircraft performance, torpedo capabilities, and naval gun accuracy all proving overly optimistic from the American perspective. The difference seemed to be that code-breaking and reconnaissance produced tangible evidence that could not easily be dismissed, while technical assessments required trusting field reports that might be contaminated by observer error or combat confusion. The institutional bias favored trusting documentary evidence over witness testimony, even when witness testimony proved more accurate. The post-war revelation of how extensive the intelligence failure had been came as a shock even to officers who had lived through the early war period. Historians examining Japanese archives discovered that Type 93 specifications had been essentially finalized by 1935, and that hundreds of these torpedoes had been manufactured and issued to fleet units by 1941. The weapon was not a wartime development or experimental design, but standard equipment that had been in service for years before Pearl Harbor. Multiple opportunities to identify the weapon's true capabilities had existed. The China incident from 1937 provided combat use that could have been observed. Pre-war fleet exercises could have been monitored by intelligence collection, and technical espionage might have acquired specifications or actual weapons. The failure to exploit these opportunities reflected not lack of access to information, but systematic unwillingness to believe information that contradicted comfortable assumptions. The Type 93 was not a secret in the sense of being completely hidden. It was a secret in the sense that evidence of its existence was systematically ignored. The institutional lesson from the intelligence failure was that military organizations needed to cultivate dissent and skepticism rather than consensus and conformity. Intelligence analysis required analysts who would challenge prevailing views when evidence suggested those views were wrong. It required senior officers who would listen to uncomfortable assessments rather than dismissing them as alarmism or incompetence. It required cultural transformation, where being right was valued more than being agreeable, and where revising estimates based on new evidence was seen as strength rather than admission of earlier error. These cultural changes proved extraordinarily difficult to implement because they contradicted military culture's emphasis on hierarchy, discipline, and unity of command. The tension between military values that emphasized following guidance from superiors and intelligence values that emphasized questioning assumptions would remain unresolved throughout the war and beyond. The question of how many lives the intelligence failure cost extended beyond Tassafaronga to include other engagements, where American forces had positioned themselves within Type 93 range while believing they were safe. The Battle of Savo Island in August 1942 saw multiple American cruisers torpedoed at ranges that seemed impossible according to intelligence estimates. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October 1942 included torpedo attacks at ranges that surprised American commanders. Multiple destroyer actions throughout 1942 and early 1943 involved American ships being hit by torpedoes launched from what Doctrine said was safe distance. The cumulative casualties from these engagements numbered in the thousands, though determining which casualties derived specifically from Type 93 underestimation versus other tactical factors was impossible. What was clear was that correcting the intelligence failure earlier would have saved lives, prevented ship losses, and potentially changed the outcomes of multiple engagements. The memorial at Arlington National Cemetery includes names of sailors killed at Tassafaronga among the thousands who died during the Guadalcanal campaign. The polished marble does not indicate which deaths resulted from enemy tactical excellence, which from American tactical errors, and which from intelligence failures that placed American forces at disadvantage they should never have faced. The institutional memory of Tassafaronga within the Navy emphasizes the tactical lessons learned and the doctrinal revisions implemented, focusing on how the Navy adapted and improved, rather than dwelling on the failures that made adaptation necessary. This forward-looking institutional memory serves morale and professional development purposes, but it also risks losing the uncomfortable lessons about how institutional culture can systematically dismiss evidence until catastrophe forces recognition. The intelligence failure at Tassafaronga was not primarily about lack of information, but about unwillingness to believe information that challenged established views, or a human failing that no procedural reform could completely eliminate, but that institutions needed to continuously guard against through conscious effort to value uncomfortable truths. The destroyer USS Charles Osborne maneuvered at high speed through the darkness off Empress Augusta Bay on November 2nd, 1943, her radar tracking Japanese destroyers at 15,000 yards. Commander Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, did not request permission from the task force flagship before ordering his destroyers to launch torpedoes. The standing orders revised after Tassafaronga authorized destroyer commanders to attack independently when tactical circumstances warranted, and Burke exercised that authority without hesitation. His destroyers launched 32 torpedoes at the Japanese formation, then turned away while maintaining speed above 30 knots. The Japanese destroyers, detecting the American attack, attempted to launch their own torpedoes, but found their formations disrupted by the need to evade incoming weapons. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay demonstrated how completely American night-fighting doctrine had evolved in the 11 months since Tassafaronga. Destroyers acting independently, launching at optimal range without delay, disrupting enemy attacks before they could develop. The cruiser formation supporting Burke's destroyers maintained standoff range of approximately 15,000 yards, using radar-directed gunfire to engage Japanese ships while staying beyond Type 93 effective range. The cruiser commanders understood from intelligence bulletins distributed after Tassafaronga that Japanese torpedoes could reach 20,000 yards or more, so maintaining 15,000 yards provided margin for evasive maneuver if torpedoes were detected. The SG surface search radar that had been experimental equipment in late 1942 was now standard throughout the fleet, and operators had learned through extensive training how to use radar for detection while relying on visual confirmation for fire control. The integration of radar and visual observation, using each system's strengths while compensating for weaknesses, represented doctrinal evolution that Tassafaronga's painful lessons had forced. The results at Empress Augusta Bay vindicated the doctrinal revisions. All American forces sank one Japanese cruiser and one destroyer, while damaging several other ships. American losses totaled 0 ships sunk, and minimal damage to one destroyer. The casualty ratio strongly favored American forces, a complete reversal of the pattern from Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and Tassafaronga, where Japanese forces had consistently achieved disproportionate results. The tactical execution was not perfect. Some torpedoes malfunctioned. Some radar contacts were lost in the confusion of maneuver. Some gun salvos missed their targets. but the overall performance demonstrated that American forces had learned how to fight night battles effectively. The institutional learning curve from Tassafaronga through Empress Augusta Bay showed how quickly the Navy could adapt when combat experience provided clear lessons and institutional leadership was willing to implement changes. The training revolution that underpinned improved combat performance was evident in the preparation Burke's destroyers had received before the Empress Augusta Bay engagement. Night fighting exercises had increased from 12 hours monthly in early 1942 to over 40 hours monthly by late 1943 for ships in combat zones. The exercises emphasized realistic scenarios, surprise encounters, equipment failures, communication disruptions, rather than the scripted peacetime drills that had created false confidence before the war. Destroyer-cruiser integration received particular attention, with exercises practicing coordinated attacks, where each ship type operated according to its capabilities. Radar operators trained in simulators that replicated combat conditions, learning to distinguish between actual contacts and false returns from weather or sea conditions. The training intensity reflected institutional recognition that peacetime preparation had been inadequate, and that combat effectiveness required investment in realistic practice. The technological improvements that accompanied doctrinal revision enhanced American capabilities significantly. The SG surface search radar, deployed fleet-wide by late 1943, offered better range and discrimination than the early models that had equipped ships at Tassafaronga. Fire control radar, still not universal, was becoming more common and more reliable, enabling gun directors to track targets through smoke and darkness. The Mark 15 torpedo's depth-keeping problems had been partially corrected through redesign of the depth control mechanism, though full reliability would not be achieved until later in the war. Anti-aircraft armament had increased dramatically. 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons replaced older 3-inch guns, providing better defense against the increasing threat from Japanese air attack. These technological improvements reflected American industrial capacity's ability to not just repair combat damage, but to continuously upgrade equipment based on combat experience. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete integration of lessons learned from Tassafaronga and subsequent engagements. So American task forces operated with destroyer screens positioned to intercept torpedo attacks, cruisers maintaining standoff ranges that exploited radar advantages while negating Japanese torpedo threats, and overall tactical coordination that prevented the kind of isolated actions where Japanese forces had previously achieved success. The Japanese forces at Philippine Sea attempted their traditional night torpedo attacks, but found that American countermeasures had evolved to the point where such attacks achieved minimal results at high cost. The Type 93 torpedo that had been so devastating at Tassafaronga remained a capable weapon, but American forces had learned how to fight in ways that minimized its effectiveness. The tactical advantage had shifted decisively toward American forces through combination of better doctrine, improved technology, and more realistic training. The statistical comparison of night battle results before and after Tassafaronga provided quantitative evidence of institutional learning. In night surface engagements from August through November 1942, Japanese forces achieved tactical victory, defined as sinking or damaging more enemy tonnage than they lost, in approximately 75% of battles. In night engagements from mid-1943 through the war's end, American forces achieved tactical victory in approximately 85% of battles. This reversal occurred despite Japanese forces continuing to employ the same doctrine and weapons that had been so effective early in the war. The difference was American adaptation, revised doctrine, better training, improved technology, and institutional willingness to learn from defeat, while Japanese doctrine remained largely static because early success had reinforced existing approaches rather than prompting continuous evolution. The human dimension of doctrinal evolution was evident in the confidence sailors expressed when discussing night combat in late 1943, compared to their apprehension in early 1942. The destroyer crews who had felt helpless at Tassafaronga, waiting for permission to fire while watching the tactical window close, expressed satisfaction that they could now act on their own initiative when circumstances required. The cruiser crews who had felt vulnerable closing to gun range against an enemy they did not fully understand, expressed relief that standoff tactics allowed them to exploit their advantages, while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. The radar operators who had been told their equipment provided decisive advantage but had watched that advantage fail to prevent defeat, expressed confidence that they now understood radar's capabilities and limitations, and knew how to use the technology effectively. The institutional learning that had seemed so painful and slow during and after Tassafaronga had ultimately produced measurable improvement in both combat effectiveness and crew confidence. The question of whether this evolution could have occurred without Tassafaronga's catastrophic demonstration remains subject to debate. Some analysts argued that the Navy had been learning from each engagement throughout 1942, and that Tassafaronga simply continued a process already underway. Others argued that earlier battles had been sufficiently ambiguous, that lessons learned were partial and incomplete, and that only Tassafaronga's unmistakable defeat, radar advantage, firepower superiority, and tactical position all favoring American forces, yet still suffering devastating loss, had forced the comprehensive reassessment necessary for real transformation. The truth probably lay between these extremes. The Navy had been learning incrementally from each battle, but Tassafaronga's clarity about what was wrong had accelerated learning and ensured that institutional response was comprehensive rather than piecemeal. The cost-benefit analysis of Tassafaronga's harsh lesson produced sobering calculations. 400 American sailors died in the battle. 3 cruisers spent 6 to 12 months under repair. 1 cruiser was lost entirely. These costs were immediate and concrete. The benefits: improved doctrine that saved lives in subsequent battles, better training that increased combat effectiveness, institutional humility that encouraged continuous learning, were long-term and difficult to quantify precisely. Historians analyzing subsequent battles estimated that improved night fighting capabilities saved perhaps 2,000 American lives over the war's remainder by preventing defeats similar to Tassafaronga and enabling victories that might otherwise have been defeats. The ratio suggested that the harsh lesson was ultimately beneficial despite its immediate cost, but this cold calculation provided little comfort to the families of those killed when the lesson was learned, or to the survivors who lived with memories of that desperate night. The evolution from Tassafaronga's defeat to Empress Augusta Bay's victory represented institutional learning at its most effective. The American Navy had demonstrated capacity to acknowledge failure, analyze causes honestly, implement comprehensive changes, and validate those changes through improved combat performance. This learning cycle, failure, analysis, revision, implementation, validation, would continue throughout the war as American forces encountered new challenges and adapted to meet them. The Japanese Navy, lacking similar institutional capacity for self-critical learning, would continue employing tactics that had been effective in 1942, but that American countermeasures had largely neutralized by 1944. The difference in institutional learning capacity would prove as significant as differences in industrial capacity or technological capability in determining which side ultimately prevailed. Tassafaronga had taught the American Navy that doctrinal excellence required continuous evolution based on combat experience, and that lesson, perhaps more than any specific tactical revision, would shape American naval operations through the war's remainder and into the post-war period. The survivors of USS Minneapolis and the destroyer Naganami met in Tokyo in 1995, all gathered for a reunion that would have seemed impossible during the desperate night of November 30th, 1942. The American sailors, now elderly men in their 70s, shook hands with Japanese veterans of similar age, comparing memories of a battle that had shaped both their lives and their Navy's institutional development. They spoke through translators about the terror of that night, the confusion of combat and darkness, the grief for shipmates who had not survived. The Japanese veterans expressed respect for American damage control that had saved 3 cruisers that should have sunk. The American veterans acknowledged the tactical excellence of Japanese torpedo employment. Both sides recognized that they had been young men following orders, executing doctrine they had been trained to follow, and that the battle's outcome reflected institutional and strategic factors far beyond individual sailors' control. The reunion represented reconciliation, but also historical perspective that only decades of distance could provide. The historical analysis conducted over 50 years revealed Tassafaronga's true significance. In narrow tactical terms, the battle was a decisive Japanese victory. 4 American cruisers damaged or sunk in exchange for 1 Japanese destroyer lost. In strategic terms, the battle was irrelevant to Guadalcanal's outcome, since the island would be lost regardless of Tassafaronga's result. In institutional learning terms, the battle was perhaps the most valuable defeat in American naval history. The lessons learned at Tassafaronga about doctrine, intelligence, training, and institutional adaptation influenced American naval operations throughout the war and shaped post-war development of naval doctrine. The 400 American sailors who died at Tassafaronga paid the price for institutional failures that should have been corrected earlier, but their sacrifice forced corrections that probably saved thousands of lives in subsequent battles. This calculus provided no comfort to the dead or their families, but it offered meaning to loss that might otherwise seem pointless. The counterfactual question of what would have happened if Tassafaronga-style defeats had continued through 1943 and 44 produced sobering estimates. Historical analysis suggested that if American night fighting remained as ineffective as it had been in late 1942, Japanese forces might have achieved similar disproportionate results in multiple subsequent engagements. The cumulative ship losses and casualties could have delayed American offensive operations by 6 to 12 months, affecting the timeline for campaigns in the Central Pacific and Philippines. The strategic outcome would likely have remained the same. American industrial superiority would eventually overwhelm Japanese resistance, but the path to victory would have been longer and bloodier. Tassafaronga's painful lesson, by forcing rapid institutional adaptation, had likely shortened the war and reduced total American casualties even though the immediate cost had been high. Admiral Raizo Tanaka's post-war reflections, recorded in interviews during the 1960s, provided the Japanese perspective on the battle's meaning. He remained proud of his destroyer's tactical performance at Tassafaronga, but acknowledged that tactical excellence had not translated to strategic success. His forces had executed their mission brilliantly, sinking or crippling 4 American cruisers, but had failed the primary objective of delivering supplies to Guadalcanal. The battle had demonstrated that Japan could win tactical victories, but could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages in industrial capacity, logistics, and ultimately the ability to sustain forces across the vast Pacific. Tanaka's assessment that Guadalcanal could not be held, which had led to his relief from command in February 1943, had proven correct when Japan evacuated the island shortly after his reassignment. His tactical brilliance at Tassafaronga was vindicated by history, but so was his strategic pessimism about Japan's ability to win a war of attrition against American industrial might. The Naval War College incorporated Tassafaronga into its curriculum as a case study in institutional learning within years of the battle. The standard analysis presented to officer candidates emphasized 6 lessons. First, intelligence failures could be as catastrophic as tactical errors. Second, peacetime doctrine required continuous revision based on combat experience. Third, technological advantages required proper tactical employment to be effective. Fourth, institutional culture that discouraged dissent and uncomfortable truths created vulnerability to surprise. Fifth, individual accountability was necessary but insufficient when systemic failures caused defeats. And sixth, is the capacity to learn from failure determined long-term success more than individual battle outcomes. These lessons remained relevant to military education decades after Tassafaronga, applied to Cold War scenarios, and later to conflicts in entirely different contexts. The battle had become not just historical event, but teaching tool for understanding how military institutions learn or fail to learn. The comparison of night battle outcomes before and after Tassafaronga provided the clearest evidence of institutional learning's value. The approximately 75% Japanese victory rate in night battles through November 1942 had reversed to approximately 85% American victory rate by mid-1943 through the war's end. This reversal occurred over approximately 8 months, December 1942 through July 1943, during which American forces had implemented doctrinal changes, enhanced training, and deployed improved technology. The speed of this transformation demonstrated American institutional capacity for rapid adaptation when combat experience provided clear lessons. The Japanese Navy's failure to achieve similar adaptation, continuing to employ tactics that American countermeasures had largely neutralized, demonstrated how early success could create institutional rigidity that prevented necessary evolution. The ultimate casualty accounting for Tassafaronga extended beyond the immediate 400 American dead to include the opportunity cost of earlier institutional failures. Oh, if the intelligence about Type 93 capabilities had been accepted when first reported in 1937, American tactical doctrine could have been revised years before the war began. If the Mark 15 torpedo problems had been acknowledged and corrected when first reported in early 1942, American destroyer attacks might have been effective at Tassafaronga and other battles. If the centralized fire control doctrine had been revised after Savo Island or Cape Esperance rather than after Tassafaronga, the 10-minute delay might not have occurred. The sum of these earlier failures was difficult to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggested that hundreds and possibly thousands of American sailors had died in battles from August through November 1942 due to institutional failures that could have been corrected with less cost if leadership had been more responsive to evidence. The post-war development of American naval doctrine showed Tassafaronga's lasting influence. The emphasis on continuous institutional learning based on combat experience became embedded in Navy culture. The recognition that technological advantages required proper tactical employment to be effective shaped how new technologies were introduced into fleet operations. The understanding that intelligence failures could be as catastrophic as tactical errors led to intelligence reforms that gave operational commanders better access to timely, accurate information about enemy capabilities. The awareness that peacetime doctrine often proved inadequate for wartime conditions created cultural acceptance that doctrine must evolve continuously rather than remaining static until major defeat forced change. These institutional changes represented Tassafaronga's true legacy, not the specific tactical lessons about Japanese torpedoes or destroyer fire control, but the meta-lesson about how military institutions must continuously adapt to remain effective. The memorial services held for Tassafaronga casualties in the decades following the battle evolved from simple commemoration to more complex historical reflection. Early memorials focused on honoring the dead and recognizing their sacrifice. Later memorials incorporated discussion of the lessons learned and how those lessons had influenced subsequent operations. The most recent memorials have included Japanese participants, recognizing that both sides lost sailors in a battle neither side wanted, but both were obligated to fight. The evolution of memorial practices reflected changing historical understanding that moved beyond simple narratives of victory and defeat to more nuanced appreciation of how individuals became caught in larger institutional and strategic forces beyond their control, and how their sacrifice could take meaning from lessons learned even when the immediate battle was lost. The question of whether Tassafaronga was worth its cost, whether the lessons learned justified the price paid, admitted no definitive answer. For the families of 400 dead American sailors, no institutional learning could compensate for their loss. For the Navy as institution, the rapid adaptation following Tassafaronga probably saved more lives than were lost in the battle itself. For historians analyzing the Pacific War's trajectory, Tassafaronga represented a critical inflection point where American forces transitioned from learning how to fight the war to executing campaigns with increasing effectiveness. For the veterans who survived and later met in reunion, the battle represented a shared experience that transcended nationality and created bonds of mutual respect among men who had faced the same terror and uncertainty. Each perspective contained truth, and collectively they suggested that Tassafaronga's significance lay not in any single interpretation, but in the multiple layers of meaning the battle carried. The final assessment of the Battle of Tassafaronga acknowledged paradox. It was a decisive tactical defeat that became strategic victory through lessons learned. It was a validation of Japanese tactical doctrine that ultimately proved irrelevant to campaign outcome. It was an intelligence failure that forced intelligence reform. It was a demonstration of peacetime doctrine's inadequacy that accelerated wartime adaptation. It was a battle where hundreds died, teaching lessons that thousands benefited from in battles yet to come. The complexity of this assessment reflected war's fundamental nature. Events that seem clear in the moment become ambiguous with historical distance. The victories reveal hidden costs, and defeats contain unexpected benefits. Tassafaronga would be remembered as the battle, where American forces learned that technological superiority and firepower advantages were insufficient without proper doctrine, accurate intelligence, and institutional willingness to learn from failure. That lesson, learned at such terrible cost on a desperate night off Guadalcanal, shaped American naval effectiveness through the war's remainder and represented the battle's true victory, not tactical success on the night of November 30th, 1942, but institutional transformation that turned defeat into the foundation for ultimate triumph.